Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. I'm Arjuna, and today got two special guests on to discuss evolution, intelligent design, and the fossil record. We've got Dr. Günter Bechly and Erika, also known as Gutsick Gibbon. Thanks for coming on, guys.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll start with brief introductions from you both. Günter, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a German paleontologist. I worked for 17 years as a curator in the paleontology department of the State Museum for Natural History in Stuttgart. And since 2016, I'm a senior fellow with Discovery Institute in Seattle, which is the think tank that is spearheading the intelligent design movement. And I'm now working on issues of the fossil record as evidence against neo-Darwinian evolution. So that's basically my background. My special field of expertise as a paleontologist is insects, and they're especially dragonflies and damselflies. And I've published a lot on taxonomy and fossil record and phylogenetics of these insects.
Cool, thank you. And Erika?
Yeah, cool. I'm Erika Gutsick Gibbon here on YouTube. My resume is certainly less impressive, but I got my BSA in pre-professional animal science, so that's a pre-veterinary track. And then I swapped around and started getting my master's of research in primatology or primate biology, behavior, and conservation, which is I've submitted my thesis and I'm pending approval, supposed to get that. And I begin my Ph.D. In the fall in biological anthropology. So I'm very much in the big mammal side of these kinds of things. But I do enjoy the broader topics. And as I was telling Gunter before, I took entomology in undergrad and I really enjoyed it. So.
Awesome. Okay, and then we'll launch into the discussion. We'll start with Günter Bechly giving a little presentation on why he thinks the fossil record doesn't support evolution. I was thinking maybe we could do half of the discussion on that, or near the end we could do a little bit on whether intelligent design is scientific or whether the hypothesis is valid or reasonable. So if we got your screen share working?
I can see.
Yeah, I hope so. You should see my initial slide. Okay. So, whole show again. So, usually the first disclaimer is that we are not talking about evolution per se, but about the mechanism. So, an unguided mechanism of random mutation, natural selection, what is often called neo-Darwinism or the modern synthesis. Is this really supported by the fossil record, which most people probably will think? So. First thing is that every theory makes certain predictions, and we can compare the predictions with the empirical evidence. And one core prediction of Darwinism is gradualism. Gradualism means that all big differences can be explained with small changes accumulating over long periods of time. And this is still true, as you can see with this quote by Richard Dawkins from his best-selling book, The Greatest Show on Earth. Of course, Darwin knew that there were problems with the fossil record, and he appealed to the incompleteness of the fossil record. But actually, today we have statistical means to test the completeness or incompleteness of the fossil record. So you can imagine the following analogy. Imagine you do beachcombing as a new hobby, and every day you find something new shells, new mussels, new starfish. But over time, repetition starts to set in, and you find stuff that you have discovered before. And after a longer period of time, you only find stuff that you discovered before. And you have to be very lucky to find a message in a bottle or a beached whale. So this same approach to test if you have sampled enough to know what is out there is used in paleontology. There it's called the collector curve, where you plot the effort that you have to invest to find new groups and the number of new fossils that you discover. And there you can test if you have reached this point of saturation where you have sampled sufficiently. Now, this test has been applied for most groups in the fossil record, and we know in these groups that we have sampled sufficiently to know if certain gaps or discontinuities in the fossil record are a signal out there in nature or if they are an artifact of undersampling of our insufficient knowledge. But this, of course, tests only the sampling of the fossil record, not the completeness of the fossil record itself. But the fossil record completeness can be estimated based on proxies. For example, if we compare how much families of modern vertebrates are preserved in the fossil record, that's about 80%. And we can extrapolate this to different time horizons using then different variables to make these estimations more precise. This, of course, also means that there's a difference depending on the taxonomic level. So the fossil record will never be complete on the species level. There we can think that probably only 1% of all species that ever existed are preserved in the fossil record. But on the level that is important for macroevolution, the differences in terms of body plans, intermediate fossils that would be attributed, let's say, to different families, there we can be pretty sure that we have a rather complete picture. So what I want to show you now is that there is a general pattern in the fossil record that is showing discontinuities and not continuities. And I will just rush through the slides. This is usually a talk of 45 minutes. So I just named the titles of the slides to give you an impression that this is not an exception from the rule, but is a phenomenon that we find in all periods of Earth history, in all groups of organisms, in all geographical regions. It starts with the origin of life, which is recorded at the very first moment in Earth history, where life is possible at all, together immediately with evidence for photosynthesis, which is quite surprising. We have a sudden appearance of the first macrofossils in the Avalon explosion. That is the appearance of the strange Ediacaran biota without precursors in the previous layers. We have the famous Cambrian explosion, where all the different body plans, the phyla of bilaterian animals appear, again, without precursors in the previous layers of the Ediacaran, with one or two exceptions. We can discuss later about possible objections to the Cambrian explosions. Further, if we go up in the stratigraphical column in the next geological era, we have the Great Ordovician biodiversification event, which has been called life's second Big Bang. And the strange thing there is that we have an inverse picture from the prediction of Darwinism. Darwinism would predict we have first minor differences of an ancestral species, and then gradually these two lineages would become more divergent and accumulate differences until after 100 million of years, they have achieved, let's say, difference in body plan and phyla level differences. But what we find in the fossil record is the exact opposite. We find the big differences on the phyla level first, and then we find this variations of the theme in the Great Ordovician biodiversification event. So a top-down pattern rather than a bottom-up pattern. In the next age, in the Silurian-Devonian terrestrial revolution, we find the sudden appearance of land plants, which has been called the terrestrial equivalent of the much debated Cambrian explosion. In the Devonian next age, about 400 million years ago, the Devonian Nekton revolution, and correlated with this, the sudden appearance of tooth-like structures in the odontode explosion. All these names are not made by creationists or intelligent design proponents, but by mainstream evolutionary paleontologists. And it's called explosions or revolutions for a reason, because it's sudden events and not gradual events. In the Devonian, we have the terrestrial revolution with the appearance of land vertebrates, and there even a temporal paradox, because the evidence for tetrapods on land predates for 11 million years even the oldest fissurpods that are the supposed ancestors of these animals. In my own group of expertise, insects, they appear all suddenly in the Carboniferous, and not only primitive forms like mayflies and dragonflies, but already insects with a complete metamorphosis, which is very striking and very surprising. So we already have beetles in the Carboniferous. In the Triassic, in the next age, we have a real carpet bombing of such explosion. And Peter Ward, who is an opponent of intelligent design, wrote that this Triassic was as important, was as important for animal life on land as the Cambrian explosion was for marine animal life. Just some example, tetrapods appeared suddenly in the Triassic. We have the sudden jump from 0 to 15 families of marine reptiles. The same pattern in gliding and flying reptiles within just 2 million years. You have these different body plans. The dinosaurs appear suddenly. There has been recently a paper in Nature Communication, and a quote from this paper. It's amazing how clear-cut the change from no dinosaurs to all dinosaurs was. Same pattern in mosasaurs, these marine reptiles. And in flowering plants, that is something, the sudden appearance of flowering plants in the Cretaceous about 120 million years ago was called by Darwin an abominable mystery because it contradicted his gradualistic predictions. And this problem has not become less, it has become bigger with 150 years of paleontological research. And this is also evidence that this is not an artifact of our insufficient knowledge, but that we should expect with this exponential increase of paleontological knowledge and research that at least this problem has become a little bit smaller, but it has become more acute and even more grave. Butterflies appear suddenly in the Tertiary without precursors, so the big butterflies, the macrolepidopterans. We have the appearance of modern birds, and it has even been called the Big Bang of bird evolution at the lower Tertiary. The same with placental mammals. Also on this chart, which we can maybe discuss later, we also see a consistent pattern that we find in all groups, that there is a mismatch between the oldest fossils, that would be this yellow line, and the molecular clock dating, which nearly all the time are much, much older than the oldest fossil records, and not just a little bit older, but so much older that this cannot be explained with the so-called signal-Lipps effect. Even in our own genus, the transition from the more ape-like Australopithecines to the genus Homo is not as gradual as it is usually pictured in textbooks. So there was a paper by one of the most well-reputed paleoanthropologists, John Hawkes, in 2000, who emphasized this non-gradual change between Australopithecines and Homo. And this has been called, wait for it, Big Bang theory of human evolution. Also, the cultural pattern in humans, even there we have this non-gradual pattern of appearance within Homo sapiens 40,000 years ago. We have the so-called Upper Paleolithic human revolution with a sudden increase of evidence for symbolic thinking. And even if we go to lower, and we leave this realm of macroevolution and go to microevolution, look at the transitions between species to species transition. All evidence that was available for these gradual transitions have vanished. There were just 3 textbook examples. One, this foraminiferans, Globorotalia, has been disproved recently in a paper 2009. The second typical textbook example is these freshwater snails from a tertiary basin in Germany. This has been refuted in a paper in 2015. And more recently, one of the best, strongest cases for gradual transition from one species to the other, Australopithecus anamensis to afarensis. Afarensis would be Lucy, the species. This has been disproven by the dating of the skull that has recently been discovered. So even on this level, there is hardly any fossil evidence for gradualism, which was, of course, the reason why Eldridge and Gould came up with punctuated equilibria to explain non-gradualism on this species level. But it was never meant and cannot explain the non-gradual transitions on the macroevolutionary level. There was a meta-study by Hunt in 2010, who studied 150 years of paleontological research since Darwin and found that there's no evidence for a directional evolution from A to B in species to species transitions. And a larger problem of this whole thing is if we accept all the datings of the fossil record and all the phylogeny and so on, and we take these windows of time that are established for certain transitions, let's say the transition from a protocytid ancestral whale to the first fully marine whales of, let's say, the basilosaurids. And we take these windows of time and then we calculate, is this window of time sufficient for the required genetic changes? And we take the standard methodological apparatus of population genetics. And you can run the numbers and can make reasonable estimates of the possible population size of ancestral whales and their generation times and mutation rates and so on. What we consistently find is that the so-called waiting times for the mutations to appear and to become fixated or fixed in a population are orders of magnitude too short to accommodate these genetic changes based on the standard methodological apparatus of population genetics. This is called the waiting time problem. These problems are actually acknowledged by the few theoretical biologists that really work on these issues. And I attended a conference in 2016 at the Royal Society called New Trends in Evolutionary Biology. And the keynote was held by one of the most well-known theoretical biologists, evolutionary biologist, Professor Gerd Müller. And here is a slide from his keynote. It's titled Explanatory Deficits of the MS Theory. Explanatory deficits what the theory cannot explain. MS stands for modern synthesis, which is just a synonym for neo-Darwinism. And he lists these things: phenotypic complexity, which is complex structures, complex organs; phenotypic novelty, novel organs, novel structures appearing, novel body plans; and non-gradual forms of transition, what we have seen before, evidence in the fossil record. If the theory cannot explain that, then there's a major problem, and this is, of course, recognized, and they now try to find alternatives in the so-called extended evolutionary synthesis, but none of the other alternatives that have been suggested, like niche construction and phenotypic plasticity and evo-devo and so on, can really close these explanatory deficits or don't even attempt to close them. So that is about a little overview of some of the evidence from the fossil record that is not so well resonating with the predictions of Darwin's theory. So I hope this was not too long. And I can stop screen sharing here and can give over to Erika.
Cool. So you can start screen sharing now, Erika. Oh, hang on. Let me.
Yes, I like to have my timer up here so I can kind of keep track of where I'm at. Right, let me share my screen. Start sharing. And you guys let me know when you can see this.
Yeah, it's here. I'm just
yes.
Oh, hang on, it's really big. Yeah, you're good to go.
All right, cool. Okay, so today we're talking about the fossil record, evolution, and intelligent design. Now, what is the case that I'm trying to make today? I hold to a pretty conventional story here, that extinct and extant biodiversity is the result of natural selection acting upon genetic variation, that is, of course, natural mutation. As people directly involved in science and the scientific method, our goal, both Gunter's and mine, is to examine and analyze the data, testing the experiment when we can, and letting the results guide us to our conclusion, with an understanding that such a conclusion may change as our data does. And I know we would both abide by that. Now, in science, parsimony is key. So currently, every relevant field in science agrees that evolution by natural selection is the most parsimonious explanation for biodiversity on Earth. This is important because many of these fields are largely independent of one another, and yet they kind of converge on this same conclusion. And as Gunter mentioned earlier, nearly as important is the ability of evolutionary theory to make correct predictions. So today we're focusing on the fossil record, and evolutionary theory predicts that the fossil record should show morphologic change over geologic time. I know we're probably going to discuss this idea of gradual change versus punctuated equilibrium, and I personally hold a combination of both, which I'm sure, again, we'll discuss a bit later. Now, relationships based on shared characteristics should be evident both with contemporaneous organisms and throughout lineages. And more importantly, these relationships should be supported, corroborated by modern genetics and evolutionary developmental biology. So I want to go over a couple of case studies kind of quickly here, but kind of like Gunter, I'm going to be rushing a little bit just because I do want to get through all of them, including human evolution, mammal evolution, cetaceans, tetrapods, birds, and Cambrian explosion. These are kind of like the sexiest lineages that people tend to bring up when this topic is entered into the conversation. So anthropology, primatology is, of course, my background. So evolutionary theory predicted that we would find dozens of morphologically distinct ape species separated in geologic time, in the fossil record that would show this gradient, the emergence of more human, quote unquote, traits from more ape, quote unquote, traits. And I'm using these colloquially because humans are, of course, hominoids and hominids. So some of the human traits that are only existing in humans and in hominins and not in, say, the other Miocene apes would be the valgus knee, our brain case size, our bowl-shaped pelvis, our dentition, which we've got these reduced canines and a parabolic palate, an inline halix or big toe, the ventral foramen magnum, so that's the hole at the base of your skull, reduced prognathism, long hind limbs, and the loss of a heavy brow ridge. Now, human evolution is proposed to have occurred over about 7 million years, which geologically is not very long. And yet we do indeed see this change occurring rather consistently through geologic time. And interestingly enough, the evolution is in fact mosaic. So in human evolution, bipedality evolved first, followed by the steady increase in brain case size after we reach approximately late Australopithecines or early genus Homo. So I love this picture. I think this is a superb depiction of our fossil record with hominids, and this is a mixture of extinct and extant, of course, A and N being extant species, and the middle being hominids. This is another really good one that shows a profile view, and it's labeled, which is nice because even though I'm formally trained in anthropology, it can still get quite difficult to see the nuance in between some of these species. So some of my favorite hominins that cross the gap would be Ardipithecus ramidus, from 4.4 million years ago. Ardipithecus ramidus is, of course, proposed to be a hominin on the line after the hominin tenon split. And the cool thing about Ardipithecus ramidus is it's already mosaic between the Australopithecines and, say, Holanthippus chilensis, an organism that's supposed to be very chimp-like. You've got this more ventral foramen magnum, reduced canine size. You've already got this heavy inclination for bipedality, despite the fact that it's got this very odd-looking halix that probably suggests a very uncomfortable gait when upright, and maybe proposes a more suspensory adaptation. But the pelvis is looking more human-like, and the hand is indeed more similar to hominins than it is to chimps and like panids. We could also consider Australopithecus afarensis or any of the Australopithecines, but afarensis is the one that's usually brought up from 3.8 to 2.9 million years ago. This organism was definitively a biped. It's got a parabolic palate, more parabolic than rectangular, rather. It's got an inline big toe. It's got a more ventral foramen magnum. It's got a valgus knee. This organism was certainly carrying its weight on top of its body, and yet its brain case size is still just only slightly above that we see in modern chimpanzees, again illustrating this idea of mosaic evolution. This is a great picture here that shows the difference between another Australopithecine, Australopithecus africanus, when compared to other hominins and a chimpanzee. Again, definitively a biped. This is uncontroversial in anthropology. Then we've got the link between the Australopithecines and genus Homo, which are the members Homo habilis and Australopithecus sediba, who were almost certainly contemporaneous. But the point of transitionals isn't to show this stepwise lineage, but the gradient of change of suites of characteristics. So these guys are, of course, almost, what more could you ask for in a transition between Australopithecines and genus Homo? We've got an intermediate brain case size, again, definitive bipedality that's much more efficient than its earlier Australopithecine comrades, a very, very genus Homo-like hand, but it's still got a rather ape-like chest, which is quite interesting. This is a cool deal. I get most of my skills from bone clones. So we've got the chimpanzee over here at the lower left, Ardipithecus ramidus, Australopithecus afarensis, Homo habilis, and Homo erectus. And what you see here is a very smooth change in the facial morphology, relative prognathism, shape of the jaw, and if you could get behind you to the movement of the foramen magnum as well. This is again occurring consistently over 7 million years. We also see a slow change in brain case size, which is something that wasn't appreciated until somewhat recently. I noticed that Gunter cited a source from Hawks from 2000, but we've discovered so many hominins in the past 21 years that I pose that is maybe a bit out of date. We see this very slow, gradual transition of the brain case size growing, and while it does speed up in its growth in the latter half, it's still trackable and consistent. We also know now probably one of the mechanisms by which this occurred with RGAP11B, a gene that when manipulated in marmosets led to a massive increase in its brain volume. We could talk about mammal evolution as well, another very sexy lineage to look at. From their locomotion, middle ear bones, dentition, secondary palate, and olfactory bulbs, we can indeed see the slow acquisition of traits. This is particularly evident in the middle ear, which is, interestingly enough, recapitulated in the development of rat kangaroos, which I found to be very, very neat. This is a comparison of a modern agama lizard, Thranaxodon, which is a fossil mammal relative, a newborn rat kangaroo, which is still pouch-bound, and an adult. And what we see is the recapitulation of the movement of the middle ear bones that we see in the fossil record, which is quite interesting. Cetacean evolution, another very sexy one. Gunter mentioned this a little bit, and I think we'll probably talk quite a bit more about it. The important aspects of it are, of course, hind limb loss, the dorsocranial nasal opening, a habitat transition, the involucrum, and dentition. The involucrum is one of my favorites because it's this itty-bitty little structure in the ear that is only held by modern cetaceans and extant animals, but is held in this tiny hoofed mammal in the fossil record, and almost nothing else, except, of course, for Ambulocetus and Pachycetus, as well as Rhodocetus and Dorodon. We also see that these guys have the joint structure of pronghorns, which are antelopes, which is very, very strange indeed, and have these very vestigial little hind limbs here in the case of Basilosaurus. They also have an astragalus, which is pretty characteristic of some of our ungulates. This is another take of kind of evo-devo, because as you can see here, this is a cetacean embryo, and at stage 13, we see the development of hind limb buds, which are then terminated by stage 17. So how strange that these guys grow these itty-bitty limb buds, very similar to what we saw in the fossil record. Tetrapod evolution, also very cool, and the important aspects here are the skull shape, the neck and cervical vertebra, hind limb presence, the tail form, and distinct wrists and digits. And again, this is recapitulated in our fossil record, or rather shown in our fossil record from Eusthenopteron, Pandorictes, Tiktaalik, Acanthostega, and Ichthyostega. And what we see is the slow change of the shape of the skull. We see the acquisition of prominent wrists and digits that go from being rather weak to being rather robust. The acquisition of chest muscles and attachments that allow for pushing up motions. And then in Tiktaalik, the further acquisition of attachments for the neck. The movement of the eyes to the top of the skull. This has been very important to note because it is indeed this slow change over time, this acquisition of traits, this suite of derived characteristics that emerges as we glance through the geologic column. And then again, we can see it when we mess around with their genes. This was an experiment done by Don et al. In 2007, where they manipulated the limbs of the skate, the digits, quote unquote, the skate, which is a chondrichthyan fish, like a shark or a ray. And what they got is when they manipulated it, we see the emergence of these very similar, almost digits rather than rays, which is interesting and unique. It's been proposed that this is something quite similar occurred in the tetrapods. Bird evolution, another really cool one. The important aspects, of course, are feathers, the sacrum, the shoulder joints, the pelvis fusion, or lack thereof, the bone density, and the dentition. And we see this as well. We see the emergence from actual flight feathers, primary flight feathers, from these downy filaments almost, and from the likes of Sinorthosaurus, sorry, my mistake, Microraptor, Archaeopteryx lithographica, Baopiosaurus, Melong, and Rhamnovis. This is indeed what we're seeing. I mean, we see the semi-lunate carpal emerging in Compsognathus, which is definitively a non-avian, non-feathered dinosaur, and yet the semi-lunate carpal is present in all of the birds of today and is indeed seen in all of the proposed transitional species. And again, when I say transitional, I want to be quite clear. I'm not meaning in a stepwise linear fashion, but rather in possession of these suites of derived characteristics changing from the more basal to the more derived. And again, we can see this when we mess with their genes. We can actually get a protofeather from a scale seen in Wu et al. From 2017. Now, the Cambrian explosion is something I know Gunter's going to want to talk about. He's written quite a bit about it, and he almost certainly knows more about it than I do. But from what I understand from Wood et al., for example, in 2019, it is generally considered that this period represents multiple bursts of life rather than a singular explosion. This singular explosion doesn't seem to be the prevailing idea anymore. And I pulled this from Wood et al. In 2019, and I think it's a quote that kind of exemplifies my point here. They say, there is currently no compelling evidence for either significant competitive replacement or biotic replacement of the latest Ediacaran to Cambrian. Indeed, we conclude that a discrete Cambrian explosion event is difficult to temporally isolate or indeed to define. The rise of early metazoans can be more simply and holistically recast as a series of successive transitional radiation events, perhaps mediated via complex environmental change, which extended from the Ediacaran and continued to the early Paleozoic. And this is an excellent figure that I got from that paper. And as you can see over on the right, the non-bilaterians and the bilaterians alike are seeing the stem groups emerge in the Ediacaran and crown groups emerge much later. But this is not to say that there is no connection that can be made. In fact, much of the Ediacaran fauna survives through this beginning of the Cambrian explosion and persists for a bit, which is interesting. Now, here's my point. Intelligent design doesn't predict anything. So my issue with intelligent design is that it lacks a model. So generally speaking, and I'm not sure, I don't want to mischaracterize Gunter, so perhaps he can elucidate this for me a bit. But from what I understand, intelligent design proposes that living organisms were created more or less in their present form by an intelligent designer. However, from what I've seen, intelligent design cannot clarify what makes a design a design. It cannot differentiate what is evolved from what is created. And this is why I don't think that intelligent design can sit alongside evolutionary theory. If we sit here today and come up with aspects of evolutionary theory that are perhaps not as well rounded out as they could be, I don't think that is an endorsement of intelligent design, because intelligent design still lacks any semblance of a model or testable predictions. It relies almost entirely on attempting to poke holes in evolution, and it has a fairly abysmal literature base. So I don't think that it can be taken seriously as a scientific hypothesis. And I'm sure we're going to continue to talk more about this and consider these ideas of what the neo-Darwinian idea is or was, and what is currently considered to be the de facto idea of how organisms change over time, because I would propose that there's a bit more to it rather than it's punctuated equilibrium or it's gradual. And I hope that we can kind of get into the weeds on this one, and that Gunter will be patient with me with my lack of entomological experience. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to this chat.
Cool.
All right, cool. We'll go into a casual discussion here. Where do you guys want to start?
I don't know. Gunter, I would love to ask you.
You can go first. If you want to, you can just ask something. If not, then I would pick up some points from your talk. So whatever you prefer.
Yeah, sure. I would love to ask you a question, actually. One of my favorite books on paleontology in general is The Ends of the World. Yeah, by Peter Brannan, which discusses mass extinctions. And one thing I noticed from your presentation, and I wrote this down, is it seems that a lot of these proposals that you've presented of these sudden appearances of new forms, they seem to emerge almost unilaterally after mass extinctions. So my question is, since from my understanding, it's pretty accepted in paleontology that massive radiations to fill new open niches are pretty common after mass extinctions, do you not think that could be potential explanation there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, a very timely question, because there is, I just put it up here, Scientific American article, which is just discussing very new research on this question, biodiversity births in the history of life. Are they related to mass extinctions or not? Now, the headline of the article is Earth's biodiversity births do not follow expected pattern. Great radiation do not always line up with mass extinction. So it's simply not the case that these births of new body plans that I have shown in my talk, that they always follow one of the five, or also some of the minor mass extinction event, like the end Ordovician mass extinction, or the Devonian Kälbwasser event, or the end Cretaceous mass extinction. Some of them do, of course, where you have these kind of alignments, that you have this emergence of modern birds not too long after the end of the Cretaceous. But many of the other events do not align, or not sufficiently close to those events that you could postulate some kind of causal mechanism. The other problem, of course, is even if they would align with mass extinctions, then the fact that a extinction event in a way clears the scene in terms of niches for new stuff to originate, does not alone explain where does the information come from to build up new body plans for organisms that then fill these niches. So this still would require an answer to this waiting time problems. If you have these very sudden appearances of fundamentally new structures, how could you accommodate these developments genetically in the available windows of times? But actually, we don't even have to, because this alignment of mass extinctions with these births of new body plans is not really a pattern that is withstanding scrutiny, according to the most recent research that is just a paper that came out in early 2000, early 21. So.
Yeah, I think that I eyeballed that paper. I don't think that I've read the entire thing, but if memory serves, it is indeed, as you kind of characterized it, that many of these mass extinctions are followed by large radiations, and some of them aren't. I would suspect, right? Yeah, I would suspect that it would not be certainly out of the realm of possibility that we aren't accounting for perhaps localized disturbances in ecosystems. This is something that we see even today when there are disturbances in local ecosystems. Certain species who are perhaps specialists can't cope. They get wiped out, and then they're filled in by generalists who then maybe end up specializing. So I think that when we're considering the geologic column as a whole, it's the biggest, sexiest mass extinctions that pop up. And if memory serves, it's been the case in the past that as we continue to look at the geologic column and consider it with geochemical signals, we tend to find more upsets than previously considered. On smaller scales, of course. It's not like we're going to find likely like another end Cretaceous extinction, as of now. I can't imagine. So perhaps. I think your example, I wrote this down when you gave it in the presentation of the whales with this waiting time problem. Mm-hmm. I'm not familiar with it in whales outside of casual conversation with this idea that extant cetaceans have these, much like many large mammals do, remarkably slow mutation rates when compared to their smaller compatriots. And so I can't help but compare it to the issue of the hominin slowdown hypothesis, which there has
mutation rate, fortunately, it is known in whales, and we have data from dolphins and from orcas about the mutation rates. And this is, of course, factored in. So we are just working on this. There's just today, there was a paper published in Journal of Theoretical Biology, co-authored by me and Ola Hörscher, who did the major work in terms of the mathematical modeling of this whole stuff with the Markov chain model. And in the whale case, where we are currently working on, we, of course, incorporated this empirical data of the mutation rate, as well as the most reasonable estimates. So we would make a kind of, assuming all the standard assumption of whale phylogeny, look what is probably a good ground plan estimate in terms of generation turnover time, what is a reasonable estimate for population size. And of course, there you can have some frame data. They will not be as big as in bacteria, and they will not be as small as in giant pandas. So you will have some population size, as in modern whales prior to the era of the whaling, when they were decimated by human activity. So you have basically all the data that are required to do the math. And the interesting thing is we looked, or we are currently looking in a particular window that is very well documented in fossil, and that is the transition from the protocetes, especially a subfamily of protocetes called the Georgia cetine. And these are considered as the closest relatives, a paraphyletic grouping of successively more closely related to the fully marine whales, which would be the Pelagiceti clade, with the earliest fossil representatives in the Basilosauride group. And what we find there is, if we take the most generous dating, so we have a paraphyletic grouping where we can use multiple fossil points to make a reasonable estimate at what point we have which changes in the vertebral column and in the axial skeleton and so on. And we have very good datings also for the basilosaurids. There is some controversy according to this locality where the oldest basilosaurids come from. That's an island in Antarctica, the so-called La Meseta formation. And we use the most generous estimate as the youngest date for this formation. If we would use the oldest date, we would not even get a waiting time, because then the fully marine whales would again be 10 million years older than the whole paraphyletic group of their supposed ancestors. So we take the most generous, most recent date, and we arrive at a maximum window of time that is available of 1.2 million years for the transition of a four-legged swimming whale, which still had a locomotion by hind-leg powered swimming, to the fully marine whale with ball vertebra, a fluke, and this fluke tail-powered way of swimming, which of course involves a lot of re-engineering of the vertebral column, of the muscular system, of streamlining the body. And to get this streamlining, you have to incorporate what modern whales share actually with hippos, but according to more recent research, share not by homology, but by convergence, that the testes, the male testes, are incorporated into the body, which is very rare in mammals. And is, of course, used for the streamlining of the body, but then raises a problem that the muscles that drive the tail fluke generate heat, and this heat has to be get rid of, because heat is bad for sperm production. As you know from these headlines, don't wear tight jeans if you want to have kids. So they came up with a countercurrent heat exchange system to cool the testes that are close to these large muscle that drive the fluke. And we know that basilosaurids had a fluke because they have the ball vertebra, even though we have no soft part preservation, but the tail vertebral column shows they had a fluke. So we have all these data about the morphology, about the fossil record, about the dating. We have the standard apparatus of population genetics. We have reasonable estimates for the times. And what we get at is waiting times that are so prohibitive. It's not in the realm that we have 1.2 million years available and the waiting time is maybe 4 million years, but the waiting times are beyond 50 million years. And that is the lowest one with an unreasonable estimate. The others are hundreds of millions of years.
So I think this is, oh, sorry.
Yeah, please, just.
No. Sorry, there's a lag, and I certainly don't want to interrupt. So this is very reminiscent to me, though, about when this idea of these mutation rates and this waiting time problem. It's very reminiscent to me of the hominin slowdown that was proposed quite some time ago. This idea that when looking at the mutation rates of extant hominids, it doesn't seem to match with the hominin evolution, with the evolutionary sequence. And so a hominin slowdown hypothesis was proposed. And a very recent paper from, I believe, 2019, if memory serves, confirmed this slowing down of these mutation rates using pedigrees of extant apes. So my thinking with this is that in the case of cetacean evolution, I have not read the paper, so you'll have to tell me whether or not we're using a consistent mutation rate or not. Because if this is something, it's an inconsistent mutation rate. How by what order of magnitude do you suppose that they're either speeding it up, or I would imagine it would be quite similar to hominids in that we're looking at a slow.
Right. For the calculation, of course, you can play with the variables, and you could show what would be reasonable variations of this mutation rates if we don't take the lower mutation rates of modern whales. And we say, well, that could be an out-apomorphy, let's say, of crown group whales that came later, and earlier whales had a faster mutation rates that is more in line with the general average in artiodactyls, which would be the larger relationship. So whales are now considered a sister group of hippos, and then would be nested within the artiodactyl clade. So you could look at experimental data. What kind of mutation rates do we have in larger ungulate mammals, especially artiodactyls? And even if you put in these numbers, it doesn't change much. So it doesn't change from one order of magnitude to another order of magnitude. It changes some million years. but it's still so prohibitive that it doesn't change the results.
Do you know what that range would be if you're proposing like an artiodactyl rate from Indohyus, and then processing that up?
We use the mutation rate from the data that are available, the highest possible that is available in the whole group of ungulate mammals. That would include artiodactyls, perissodactyls, and the lower end, we have used the modern rate of the somewhat slower mutation rate of modern whales. I would have to look in the paper what are the actual numbers of these mutation rates. But what you would have to postulate to let's say get around the conclusion is a totally out of place mutation rate that is not found in any kind of modern larger mammal, which cannot be totally excluded, but that would of course be an ad hoc hypothesis that then would need some justification.
I would agree with the sentiment entirely. What I'm thinking is that what we're looking at here is, in my opinion, a preponderance of support for transition from an organism that was terrestrial to some degree to the modern cetaceans that we have today. And if it's an issue of mutation rate, what I would love to know is what if we take I'm more asking for like the range in millions of years. Because I've seen it proposed before that when we're looking at whale evolution, they might be like, oh, well, 10 million years is simply not long enough to get from an organism like Indohyus to get to an organism like Basilosaurus. But as someone who studies hominins, I would propose that the transition from something like Sahelanthropus to perhaps something like Homo sapiens is quite a large change as well. And that occurred in 7 million years, which is 3 million years less. So I'm curious as to if you know off the top of your head, if we take the artiodactyl rate and the basilosaurid rate, or rather modern cetacean rate, once you get to Dorudon and Aviosaurus and Basilosaurus, etc., what that time scale has been proposed to be.
So the time scales are always a set. So because you have various variables, so we allowed for multiple solutions. So you needn't have to get a single target. There could be different targets in the realm of regulatory regions, of binding sites. It depends how many genes do you look at. Do you just look at 2 coordinated genes, 3 coordinated genes, how many you include? So the realm of time varies between 47 million years to times some 100 million years. If you look at the best estimate of the mutation rates, you get these 47 million years. If you take more reasonable estimates, then you end up in realms of, let's say, 200 million years. And that basically aligns very well with data that have been shown for the human lineage by Duret and Schmidt, who tried to refute Michael Behe, who first came up with this waiting time problem, looking at malaria and looked simply at empirical data and said, well, in malaria, we always have this kind of drug resistance developing against the drugs that are used for malaria, Fansidar, Lariam, and Resochine, and whatever. But in the case of chloroquine, which is the Resochine malaria treatment, it took several decades till resistance developed. And it turned out when we found the genetic underpinnings of this mechanism of resistance, in all the other cases, there was a single point mutation sufficient. But in the case of chloroquine, it was 2 coordinated mutations were required, which means you have 2 mutations. Each of the mutations is neutral and has no selective advantage, but only together they have a selective advantage. And of course, if we looked at the empirical data in malaria, he could extrapolate, let's say, the different population size of malaria, plasmodia, the different generation time, and then and look at the mutation rates, and then transpose this on humans. And he made a prediction. And this prediction was sounding outlandish because it was something like 10 orders of magnitude longer than the existence of the universe. So, of course, this had to be refuted. And then came Duret and Schmidt, 2 evolutionary biologists, and they made a study and they looked at it and said, oh, you got it all wrong. We have our simulation, and it showed know for a single pair of coordinated mutation in the human lineage, you wouldn't have to have 10 to the power of 17 million years. No, it would be sufficient to have 216 million years, which is a little bit longer than the 6 million years that are available since the split of the chimp and the human lineage. So that were data actually by evolutionary biologists, and they came up with the most obvious counter argument, which probably might be one of your ideas also, and that is to say, well, this whole argument is committing the lottery fallacy or the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. You're predefining a kind of target, and then you're saying, hey, it's so unlikely to hit this target, but it had to hit anywhere, so this whole calculation of probability is not reasonable.
Oh.
The problem is.
No, I agree. Sorry, I'm with you. I wanted to let you know I was still listening. I would like to touch on that in a bit. And if you get a chance to, would you tell me that cetacean paper? I'd like to look up and see what their best case.
The cetacean paper is not yet out. We are currently working on it. So we have published now the mathematical paper, the theoretical paper on the simulation. So on the algorithm, what parameters are considered. We, for the first time in these kind of considerations, because that is not a creationist crazy idea. That is a mainstream topic, this waiting time problem, also in cancer research. And there are a lot of papers trying to simulate this, and we have the first algorithm that could simulate also back mutation, genetic drift, genetic tunneling, and all these kind of phenomena that could influence the result. So we have now presented basically the methodological background and are now working on the application on the whale case. So that is something that is currently in the making and will hopefully be submitted later this year. So I cannot give you a reference yet. There is some stuff out there if you Google waiting time problem and whales on the more general level without too much mathematical stuff, just making this argument basically by Richard von Sternberg, who's also working at Discovery and is co-author of our manuscript. So yeah, you can get an idea about the argument looking at this stuff, but the paper itself is not yet
I'll be interested. Yeah, I'll be interested to see that because from my perspective, right? I think that when you've got it's kind of a situation like this. When you've got a parsimonious data set that's like, okay, from the Evo-Devo stuff, from the genetic relationship to other extant mammals, from the fossil record and how that correlates with molecular clocks, which you correctly pointed out, of course, you know this probably more than I do. Those are usually they don't have quite a continuity. Molecular clock tends to be older than the fossil record. Interestingly enough, because humans are so narcissistic, we've studied the molecular clock and the fossil record most thoroughly in hominids.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
There was a recent paper that came out that actually, again, using pedigrees, rectified this issue of the molecular clock and fossil record discontinuity. It was completely in marriage once the hominin slowdown is continued. So I almost wonder if, in the case of the cetaceans, if we're not dealing with something similar. And again, I don't know the cetaceans as well as I know the hominins, but I could defend the case of the hominin slowdown hypothesis quite thoroughly. And I think something that's quite a bit important, or that's important rather to consider, is that in the case of the hominins, all of these changes that appear quite large and appear quite important, this transition to bipedality, massive changes in dentition, brain case volume, things of that nature, they end up being, at least to our knowledge, as we continue to learn more, relatively small, unimpressive changes in the genome that lead to large-scale changes. So, and I'm not going to speak on the cetaceans because that's, of course, not my specialty. I'm interested to see kind of what you put out, but I kind of wanted to, because I'm not quite sure what, I guess, where you're coming from as an opposition. So, do you suppose? And I guess I just want to ask this question and kind of let you go there. Because at present, like I said, until I can kind of see the data, I don't quite see it as a problem for cetaceans or for hominins quite yet. But from your perspective, do you suppose there's like subsequent creation events, or do you suppose that it's a tinkerer situation, or perhaps that there's this one original creation at a single cell or at the Cambrian explosion, and then kind of winding it up and letting it go? And where do you suppose humans fit into all of this?
Okay, so that is, of course, a whole plethora of questions that all involve also stuff that have nothing to do with the science. So that also go into worldview issues, but I will expand on that. So my reasons for having problems with the Darwinian mechanism have nothing to do with theology. So when I started to become an intelligent design proponent, I was not only not a Christian, but not even a theist. I was very much into Whiteheadian process metaphysics, even named the species after Alfred North Whitehead. So that was not much. I was not longer materialist, but I was not even a theist. So creation was not on my radar. Of course, when I became more involved with the intelligent design movement, I explored this possibility. I also co-authored a chapter with Stephen C. Meyer for this theistic evolution volume discussing this question. What about the evidence for common ancestry? Is it unequivocally pointing to common ancestry, universal common ancestry, or not? My personal opinion is the following. I think the overall evidence, if we take the fossil record and genetic similarities and the pattern of similarities in comparative morphology and biogeography and so on, that this is most elegantly and most parsimoniously explained by universal common ancestry. That is the scientific side. Meanwhile, for totally different reasons, which are more related to philosophical arguments and historical arguments, I have become a Christian. And then, of course, the question is now, how do you interpret this whole stuff in terms of your background worldview? And there, actually, I don't even really understand why some Christians seem to have a problem with being descended from ape-like ancestors. I don't care if my granddad was a ape-like hominin or not, because let's say if ultimately God is behind this whole process, what difference does it make if you are descended from a living being, from an ape, or from an animated clump of clay? So why should the one be more lowly or less desirable in theological terms than the other? So I don't care. So for me, it's basically a scientific question, and the science, to me, rather points to a common ancestry. So the question is then, how do you explain these bursts of information, not only in the fossil record, but also then if you include this question where you I've seen on YouTube, you had several debates and videos on the origin of life. And there the crucial question, how did this mechanism of this genetic code, the translation of the genetic code with ribosomes then into ultimately proteins, how did this originate? How did the first replicator originate? What about other questions like the origin of consciousness and so on that would, let's say, transgress biology and go into realms of philosophy of mind? For me, the best explanation there also is not necessarily divine intervention in space-time, because I find this in a way a little bit inelegant. And it also poses theological problems, let's say, like the problem of evil. If you look at the very intelligent design that meets all criteria that have been suggested as criteria for intelligent design, specified complexity, irreducible complexity, we not only find a beautiful organism, but in quite nasty bugs and diseases. So the question is, what best explains the origin of the structure and these bursts of information? And I think there are mechanisms that can explain this, depending, of course, how far you are willing to give up this materialist paradigm, which is apparently not so hard for physicists who have all this background of modern quantum mechanics and starting to doubt materialism anyway, because it turns out that space-time is not fundamental but emergent and so on, but that would go too far here. So if materialism is not true, then there are several options there. And I think that you could ultimately explain this intelligent design as a kind of quantum computation on the level of DNA, where you have entangled parts of DNA. And this has been shown, at least on the level of bacteria. And there are even books about this by mainstream evolutionists, an issue that is called Quantum Evolution, for example, a book by John Joe McFadden. That you would have kind of entanglement on the level of DNA, and then you would have a collapse of the wave function in those branches of the wave function that are statistically more frequent, which would be those branches where adaptive mutations lead to, let's say, survival and further propagation of this lineage. And that would mean you would have adaptive macromutations. So in a way, a mechanism that would resonate with this idea by Richard Goldschmidt of this hopeful monster idea. You would still have common ancestry, but you would have large changes on a macroevolutionary level in very few generations. And this, of course, would also then explain the fossil record quite well. So my tendency is towards a kind of saltationism, mutationism in terms of evolution.
So I remember reading that on your blog, and I thought that was an interesting take, because I am of the position, and I would imagine at least some of the paleontologists that I know would abide by this as well, that the fossil record is characterized both by this punctuated equilibrium in times of, as you mentioned earlier, open niches, as well as these gradual changes. And the area, of course, that I know the gradual changes the best would be hominins. And that is what I see. I see this gradual acquisition of traits that is, of course, recapitulated when we look to the genetics and molecular clock on these things. And so to me, and I think that you put that quite well. I would tend to, of course I would agree. I'm a fan of common ancestry. And when, talking about the origins of life, that's quite a bit outside of my realm of understanding. I do my best to try and keep up to date on it, I suppose. So I think that's kind of a decent transition, if you will, because I know as you wanted to talk a bit about intelligent design as an idea, I guess. And so for me, and I've talked to Dr. Rana and a couple of other folks kind of in the ID community. And the problem that I keep running into is that, as someone who's quite skeptical of it, is that the mechanisms and the criteria that have been proposed, they don't appear to be standardized, and they don't appear to be empirical in a sense that we can currently measure them and apply them in a way across the tree of life that consistently works. And for someone who is skeptical on the idea, and as you said, there is an element to this that it depends on how far you want to go. And I think that that's totally fair to say. So, if you're trying to get, if you're perhaps making a case for it, I suppose, rather than trying to convince me, because we're just having a conversation, then I would propose that it would be, in order to consider intelligent design on the same playing field as evolutionary theory, which I agree is quite elegant, certainly not all figured out, but quite elegant as it is, you almost have to have this model, these mechanisms, this empirical aspect to it. And in the sense of these areas of, for lack of a better term, punctuated equilibrium, where you've got these body forms coming out, seemingly out of nowhere, with no discernible extinction event to tie them to, which, again, to my knowledge, they tend to be pretty tieable, but I haven't read the recent paper that you brought up other than eyeballing it, so I could be incorrect on that one. I would imagine that I would ask, rather, that you would have a tangible means by which to discuss these kinds of, I think you used this phrase on your blog, but like almost like a download of information that causes these macroscopic changes. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so several things. So one is, I would totally agree that intelligent design must fulfill the main criteria for the scientific method to be, let's say, in the same ballpark as other theories. So one of the main criteria, of course, is that since humans are fallible and we can come up with all kinds of crazy ideas that may or may not match reality, that you can test the theory and that you can make predictions and that you can verify this stuff or falsify and refute the hypothesis. So you said in your talk that intelligent design predicts nothing. That's actually not true, and that is often repeated, but it's still false. And many people will only appeal to this prediction of junk DNA, but there is more. So, but just for those who have not heard about it, so the assumption based on the Darwinian supposition was that most of the genome is simply garbage left over from this random process. And of course, we know that the largest part of the genome is not coding for proteins, so it was called junk DNA, and it was assumed that it's good for nothing. The prediction from intelligent design theory is that there should be a function for this if it is there. And actually, with the ENCODE project, it turned out that most of these regions have been shown to have functions. And for all the others, the more we look, we find crucial functions for these non-coding areas, which seem to have a kind of function like an operating system for gene regulation and so on, switching on and off genes, and also some mechanical function for stabilizing DNA and so on. So that was one prediction. More. But forget this, because that is so often repeated and has so often been discussed. I think a more important prediction is based on something that Bill Dembski has formulated in his early work, which he called the universal probability bound. And that is that he said, well, we can look what are the probabilistic resources in the universe that could explain certain events. We can take the age of the universe, can divide it by the Planck time. There is no physical process that can be shorter than the Planck time. We can look at the volume of the universe and can divide it into voxels of a diameter of Planck length. Nothing could happen beneath the Planck length. And yet then you would have basically the number of possible events in the history of the universe. And then you can look what kind of results could reasonably be produced by processes of chance and necessity, and what not, what would be beyond the realm of reasonable events that could be produced by these probabilistic resources. And he predicted that there could be no specified information beyond 500 bit that could be produced by a non-intelligent, non-guided process. So all you would have to do is use an evolutionary program like Avida or Tierra or name it. There have been several softwares developed and create some not only unlikely string of code, because any kind of combination of signs is unlikely, but a kind of specified code that has a meaning or that does something that is longer than 500 bit, and you have refuted the core prediction by intelligent design theory. So the theory is testable, it can be refuted, and it should be done relatively easily. So that is actually one point which makes me skeptical that we couldn't find, neither in computer simulation nor in these long-term experiments like Lansky's long-term experiment with colibacteria, which, if you look at the generation time and at the mutation rates and the population size of bacteria, what he did in the lab basically equals, in terms of evolutionary potential, the whole evolution of vertebrates since the Devonian. But nothing really significant happened, even though he used heavy adaptive pressure by using chemics. And the basic thing, the most striking thing that happened, that they acquired some possibility to metabolize citrate. And it turned, that was cherished in the press, breakthrough, Darwinism proven, and so on. And then it turned out that this whole information was already present in the gene and was just a question of switching on and switching off pre-existing information, and not generating a new gene. So these attempt to show the Darwinian process and to refute this prediction by intelligent design theory that the probabilistic resources in the universe are not sufficient for this process to achieve what it is said to do. That's something that shows that this is a theory that is in principle falsifiable, but it has not been falsified. Another question is this question, there's no model, which you touched and said, well, but what is the model? I have a little bit elaborated that there could be models. It's the thing that I have in mind with this kind of quantum evolution is also quite easily testable, because if you could show that there are no sufficiently long strands of DNA that are existing in quantum entanglement, then the whole idea collapses, and at least this approach would be refuted. There has been another idea based more on information theory and on analogies with object-oriented programming languages called the dependency graph proposal by Winston Ewart. So there are different mechanisms that have been proposed. It's not like intelligent design proponents just say, well, God did it. We have no clue how it evolved, and therefore God did it. That is a common misunderstanding. And then you hear this God of the gaps objection that intelligent design is an argument from ignorance, but it's not an argument from ignorance. It's not based on what we don't know. It's based on what we do know about the working of the universe, of our repeated, constant, regular observation, what causes can bring certain effects into being. And we know that significant amounts of specified information only come into being by the activity of an intelligent agent. And there is no other cause that we ever have found in the universe that could produce this. So it's an argument from in a kind of inference to the best explanation based on what we do know. And we don't even have to have a mechanism, because if you would, let's say you would find some strange scratch marks on Mars on a rock, then you would have the possibility to use the same methodology that intelligent design uses to distinguish, could this be produced by wind and erosion on Mars, or is it a kind of writing system from an alien civilization? And you wouldn't have to know who did it, for which reason did it, what kind of technologies were used to produce these signs. It is sufficient to show that you have an unlikely pattern that matches an independently given pattern. And this method is totally uncontroversial in fields like SETI research, where you distinguish, is some signal from space produced by a quasar, or is it an alien civilization sending us the prime numbers? Or it's uncontroversial in archaeology, where we distinguish human-made artifacts from other artifacts. It's uncontroversial in forensics, where we distinguish, was somebody murdered or did he die from natural causes? And I would be interested, what is your objection to use the same approach that is totally uncontroversial in those fields in the natural sciences, and then let the evidence, let the empirical data decide if there is evidence for an intelligent cause or not? Why should we exclude a priori one type of causes and say, well, that's not allowed, and not just say we use the same methodology that we use in other fields where it's uncontroversial, and then look, is there support for intelligent design or not, and follow the evidence wherever it leads?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot there, and I'd like to touch on quite a bit if that's okay, because there's some stuff that I think is important to address. So the first thing, that discussing junk DNA, I think that that's an interesting one, because to my understanding, and I feel that I've looked into this sufficiently, because this is a fairly, as I'm sure you know, a fairly common conversation to have in the ID world. It wasn't so much that the junk DNA was predicted by evolutionary theory, so much as when the human genome was being sequenced and quite a bit was shown to be non-coding, it was said it was assigned as junk DNA, not currently known as a purpose. It wasn't like it was a prediction that then failed. Intelligent design came out and they're really seized onto the ENCODE information. And looking into ENCODE and seeing what some of the researchers have said since 2012 when the initial paper came out, on how many of the folks who worked on that paper feel that their definition for function that is being transcribed is not an applicable or useful definition for function, nor is it the typical one. I think that a very easy and quite elucidating example of knowing that, and I feel confident in saying this, and knowing that the genome is not 100% functional, or rather it is quite non-functional. And while I want to touch on the finding new functions for things as well, is knockout tests in the likes of mice. So we do knockout tests a lot. They're very useful for disease and for isolating certain genetic disorders. And we can knock massive gigabase portions of the mouse genome out, and that mouse can still move on and have viable offspring in and of itself. And these are large portions of the genome. And they'll go on and reproduce and have offspring with no problems, to our knowledge. So to me, this is very evident that the genome is not 100% functional. I don't think that was an ID prediction, and I don't think that was an evolutionary theory prediction. I think that became a conversation after the
Just interrupt with a question.
Yeah.
With the same reasoning, you could say that one of your eyes is without function, or that one leg is without function, because you could remove it and you still could reproduce and could be a viable organism and could even have reproductive success. So the fact that you can knock out something doesn't imply that it is without function, and is not doesn't even imply that it's not necessary for the organism in terms of long-term effects. It just means it doesn't immediately cause the organism either to die or to be infertile. So
if you look at some of the that they've done, and I can link several papers for this. These gigabase knockouts are seen like they're observed through successive generations, and it isn't like these organisms are blind. It isn't like they have any clear fitness benefits. Something which is discussed quite thoroughly in some of these papers. I believe one of them might have been from 2013, but I can put them in the description afterwards. So it's not, I don't think that that's a proper analogy. I don't think that analogy works, because these organisms, it's not just that they can survive and reproduce, it's that they can survive and reproduce, meaning that there isn't even a developmental problem. There isn't anything evidently wrong with them, and there isn't anything evidently wrong with their offspring, suggesting that it isn't even akin to some of like our ERVs, for example, which have function only in the context of development. So I would argue that isn't an appropriate analogy. I think your conversation about the scratches on Mars is very interesting, because as someone in anthropology, something that we deal with a lot is how to tell the difference between a stone tool and a rock. How do we infer design in these two things? How can we tell the difference between something that is designed and something that is not? And I talk about this a lot because there is a set of criteria there, in the sense of how do we tell something's designed and something isn't. One, it's nice because we can see designers actively designing, whether it's human hunter-gatherers still using stone tools, some of which do, or chimpanzees and bonobos, which also use stone tools and in fact have their own archaeology. We know the designers, right? We know that there is a designer that is present. Moreover, we can mimic the designer's actions and see what kind of precision hammering, for example, results in certain shapes, and what can't be mimicked by, say, a rock rolling down a hill. And that's how we can tell a design from a non-design, because we have the designer and we have the criteria to tell the difference. And we've done experimental work on what we can get from natural processes versus what requires an active hand. And so I think that isn't present in the intelligent design community. I think that like when I'm talking about a workable model, I'm not talking about something, the example of kind of functional information without intelligence, I also don't think that is the case. I know that there has been quite a bit of biochemical work on how we get new functional information without an intelligent intervener. A classic example in large-scale organisms is the antifreeze protein in ice fish. This is a de novo protein. It very literally came from nothing. It's not an adaptation of a protein that used to do something different. It's a de novo protein in the truest sense of the word. And as far as the Linsky experiment, while that isn't my field, to my understanding and having read quite a bit on it and talked to some folks who are quite close to it, it's not simply a matter of turning things on and off, but rather it's a bit more complicated than that. And it has quite a bit to do with the environment that is at play, which is kind of the ultimate issue of what natural selection can do. Because it's not just the raw mutation, it's the raw mutation and the circumstances that surround it. And I think that, we can get a lot further than I would propose that you're maybe giving it credit for. Ending on the scratches on Mars, and And as a side note, I think it's quite interesting that that you've got this paper on the bits, the 500 bits, and what is truly probable given the circumstances of the universe. I'm very skeptical of papers that try to do probability that take into account so many variables, because I don't think that we can. I mean, we can't even take in all of the variables into account when you're, say, observing an organism and trying to catalog its behavior. There's a margin of error in that, and that's something that I do, right? It's like I observe an organism and I say, well, they're behaving this way because of this. You can't even say that. We can make a best guess, but I'm skeptical of papers that try to take so many variables into account, because I don't think that is I don't think that it is going to be as robust as taking smaller sections and working their way up. So I'd be interested to look into that paper and kind of see how they did it. And as a last bit, I have one more note that I wanted to talk about here. You mentioned the arch, or not the arch example, the scratches on Mars. Suppose we came upon a beautiful arch on Mars. And the two of us approach it, and I say, wow, it's incredible that the wind and the weather on Mars created this arch. And you say, well, I think that this arch is actually designed. I propose that this is a designed arch. And I say to myself, okay, but we know that arches can form naturally. And you say, we know that arches can indeed be designed. And I'm thinking to myself, but there's no designers that know of that live on Mars. So I would propose that it's most parsimonious to move with this idea of a natural arch, unless you can provide support that there is kind of a present designer. Because I think that that's so important when we're trying, like in empirical areas of science that we're differentiating design from non-design. The presence of the designer is always at play. And I realize that gets into kind of some messy business, and I know that that's kind of more of a theological, more of a spiritual question, and there's a jump that needs to be made there, faith stuff and all that. So I'm not trying to kind of necessarily say that isn't the case. I'm more pushing back on this idea that intelligent design can be kind of confined to this realm of the empirical and then taught alongside a truly naturalistic theory. Not to say that evolutionary theory is in fact naturalistic. I would have no problem if tomorrow we received evidence directly from the designer themselves that they were tinkering in the entire affair. The fact remains is the sequence of events exists as it does, and whether there's a tinkerer or not, that change does exist in the fossil record and is recorded in the genetics. So I guess my pushback to what you said is I don't think the ENCODE thing works. I think we do see functional information without the impact of intelligence. I think Lenski is a bit more complicated than was presented, and I think that we need a little more from intelligent design. As far as creating a model that is going to stand alongside it. And I'm a bit skeptical about a claim that says that it takes so many variables into account as far as the reality of the universe. Sorry.
No problem. That's reasonable objection. So let's look at some of them. So one is this question of the presence of the designer, which of course is quite crucial, and that is also a common objection which is made against intelligent design, is that in other cases, like in forensics, we know there are potential murderers out there, so there is a reasonable estimate that the designer exists of such a case. But is, for example, not the case in SETI research. We have no evidence that there are any aliens out there. Nobody has ever seen anyone, and still we can do the research looking for them. And we have the exact same criteria to distinguish radio signals from outer space, which have an intelligent origin, from those that probably have a natural or mechanistic origin. And this has even been made to a theme in this famous Contact movie based on a story by Carl Sagan, who was, of course, anything but a proponent of intelligent design. But he had basically the same idea and said, well, there is the prime numbers that are sent by the signal from outer space that cannot be explained with a natural process like a quasar or a pulsar star, that is a clear hallmark of intelligence, because it's not only that this sequence is unlikely, but because it matches some independently given pattern, which is this crucial criterion to distinguish if some unlikely pattern is pointing to an intelligent cause or not. And easy analogy would, of course, if you walk along the beach, then any kind of pattern of grains of sand is same unlikely, whatever it is. But if you come around a pattern that says John loves Mary, even though this pattern is unlikely as some ripple marks or any other pattern of this particular grains of sand, you will immediately know that this was not produced by waves, but by an intelligent agent. So the SETI case shows it's not necessarily the case. It's a possible assumption to know that there is a designer out there, but it's not a necessary prerequisite to make the design inference. You can be totally agnostic if there is a designer out there and just look at the evidence in the patterns that you find and then infer the existence of a designer, whoever this designer is. And actually that is done in physics, based not on biological data, but, for example, on this fine-tuning of the physical constants and laws of physics. And there a lot of people come up, either they prefer if they have this totally naturalistic inclination with the multiverse, but many others who are atheists now come up with this kind of simulation theory, and that we are living in a kind of matrix, and there are respectable people like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Elon Musk who are proposing these things and have said that the likelihood we are living in a simulation is more than 50%. And this shows that this intelligent design inference is used unless it points to, let's say, something supernatural, then it's not allowed. So, of course, I would make the case if you, let's say, have a theistic background and you want to identify the designer, which is not within the realm of the method. That's not cowardly by intelligent design proponents that they say we cannot identify the designer, even though most of them are theists and probably think that God is the designer. But simply the empirical method to distinguish certain patterns, are they caused by chance and necessity or by intelligent agent, doesn't allow for the identification of the designer unless you invoke independent criteria. And I would suggest that as a theist, of course, you would use independent criteria and would use philosophical arguments about the applicability of mathematics and the natural sciences, or on the origin of phenomenal consciousness from dead matter. Why are there laws of physics at all? Questions like why is there anything rather than nothing, and so on, to infer with a philosophical argument the existence of a divine being. And then, of course, you have the argument that there is a potential candidate for a designer that would be responsible for, let's say, design of the universe and would have to be outside of space-time. So that is the point of the presence of the designer. You also mentioned that in other cases, we have the possibility to mimic the process, and we can do experimental paleontology and create these stone tools and then look, does these patterns of marks resemble the stone tools that we find out there? But something similar, of course, is the case in genetics when we do genetic engineering, and we look also in origin of life research, where you have to prepare the whole experiment in a certain way to get certain result. It's not like we just put this ancestral soup and let some lightning strike or make some inferences at deep sea smokers and don't do anything else to it in the lab, but we have to purify the substances. We have to get rid of some intermediate products. We have to take care that the circumstances are in a way that they do not degrade or not too much accumulate and so on. So you could infer that there is some mimicking of this design process in this whole realm of genetic engineering and artificial chemistry, production of artificial production of proteins, designing, engineering of proteins, where we see that there are certain patterns that would resonate quite well with the design approach. So I think this mimicking is a valid point, but is actually present. And the final point, you said, well, this universal probability stuff invokes too much variables. Actually, it doesn't. It only invokes two variables, and that is the size of the universe, which is very well established, and the age of the universe, which is also very well established. So that is basically mainstream cosmology on the level as any other scientific results that you would consider rather as knowledge than as theory in terms of being by repeated testing being established. And you don't need anything else because it just calculates the number of possible events. This includes anything, any type of different elementary particle. How could one electron there counter-react with one proton there? Or it's the total number of possible events, even on the lowest elementary particle level in the whole universe over its whole existence. And this is the maximum number of events that are possible. You can forget about all the other variables. That is the limit. More cannot happen, at least not in our universe. Of course, what you can do is inflate the probabilistic resources and say, oh, we are not just the only universe, there is an infinite number of universes. And there's a reason why some origin of life researchers are now willing to go that route, like Eugene Koonin, who is now invoking an infinite number of other universes to solve the origin of the first replicator. And these are people who are very sympathetic to any other naturalistic approach to solve this, and they have concluded it didn't work. So that's not my field of expertise. I cannot say anything particular on that, but I find it striking that naturalistic scientists who are expert on the origin of life research feel so desperate that they are rather willing to say there's an infinite number of universes where anything that can happen does happen, and including that we are having this conversation in all kinds of varieties with different t-shirts wearing and so on, to go that route to solve this problem. It shows it is a problem. It's not something that critics of a naturalistic origin of life, which is, of course, different from Darwinism. Darwinism would just kick in when you have this replicator. At least they're a self-replicating macromolecule. But it's still, and that's a reason why this origin of life problem was one of the points that made me think, if you cannot solve this problem without invoking either a multiverse or a kind of design hypothesis, then of course, even though Darwinism is something else and only kicks in when you have this replicator, the question is, why then exclude those other alternatives in those cases if you already need it for getting this whole process started? And as it happens, there are evolutionary biologists who realize that it's difficult to come up with some explanation for the origin of some very complex structures, and they also are already considering the multiverse as possibility to say, well, evolution happens in many parallel universes, and here we are. We could not be in a universe where it didn't happen. So, I think there is a reasonable case to make that there are strange hypotheses needed to really explain the evidence.
I think, yeah. Sorry, Gina, I saw that.
Oh, yeah, we've got about 30 minutes left. I know Gunter's been doing a lot of talking, so give you Erika some time to make some points, and then maybe we can take some questions, or we could just keep going back and forth. There's just one or two questions, but if I ask for them, they'll probably come in.
Yeah, this is a great conversation. Yes, I think that you've posed a lot of interesting topics there. Alien research is very interesting. It's almost a bit topical because I was reading about this just yesterday. Actually, some of the things like the WOW signal and the recent large someone put it in the side chat actually OMA or something. Large yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, that was tumbling through the solar system, and we were like, well, we don't know what it is. Maybe it's artificial. And it's very interesting because whenever these potential alien situations pop up, we tend to forget about them for a while, and then when you go and revisit them, you'll find that there were in fact kind of issues with it. Natural explanations that were uncovered kind of after the fact. So kind of in your case of John Loves Mary, we know that we're the only ones who write. So there isn't a current naturalistic explanation for John Loves Mary. So in that case, I would say you're correct. If we were to find writing on the beach, knowing that humans write on the beach all the time, and knowing we're the only ones with written language, and knowing that we frequent the beach because we like it there, I would think that that was completely reasonable to look at that and say, yes, that is very clearly designed. We know of the designer. We know the designer designs a lot, and that the designer likes the beach. So I think that that's a very fair statement to make. But suppose we found out that there's a species of hermit crab that's quite heavy, and it happens to make these strange, markings in the sand that resemble words occasionally. I think then at that point, you would have to say, okay, well, we've got a design explanation and a natural explanation, and then consider tandem. The problem comes with a lot of these alien research proposals, like SETI and things of that nature, is that we don't know all of the natural explanations that are at play, nor do we know all of the design aspects that are at play. It's quite different than here on Earth, when it's like, well, we see evolutionary adaptations occurring now. We see them genetically in certain experiments. We see them in nature. We see them in the health record. These changes over time, and we don't yet see the activity of an active designer outside of ourselves. So I think that at that point, it's almost an Occam's razor situation, and also a problem of deficit. I think design is at play, but only when you have no natural explanation or you have evidence of the designer, as we kind of said previously. I totally agree with you. I think the idea of inferring things like the multiverse or the simulation or whatever, I think all that's kind of bonkers. I don't think we have any support for that I've seen. And so when guys like Elon Musk or deGrasse Tyson, even though they're certainly more educated than me in certain areas, I see kind of their work when they're proposing things like simulation, and it seems a lot less robust than their other stuff. So I tend to be kind of wary about things like that. So I would totally agree with you. With regard to the origin of life and this idea of kind of working in the lab, may I suggest, and maybe you have, looking into the work of Diemer. He's done some very interesting stuff, and there's appeared on a couple of channels here on YouTube recently with hot springs. He goes to these hot springs and pours, chemical concoctions. The biochemist, I believe, someone in the chat may correct me, into these hot springs, and then observe biochemically what goes on, because these are an excellent analogy kind of for potential prebiotic Earth in certain scenarios. And it's certainly, I'm not certain if the current paradigm is that we're still hot smokers, or we're more into the normal pond or the hot springs. It kind of does bounce around as more data comes in. But I think that he's had some very interesting results, because if memory serves, he's gotten quite a few very important compounds and molecules just from pouring these basically chemical soups into an environment conducive to them. And there's details there, but I'm with you. It's not my field, so I tend to be very wary of talking about it. And I think with the conversation about the variables, I wanted to ask you kind of a question about that also, before I sense that's going to lead into you responding. Comment quickly on the multiverse idea and the origin of life. I think that's kind of bonkers too. Like this idea that something is so improbable, so we have to have all of these different universes acting in tandem. And it's just like, I don't think we've got any support for that, at least that I know of. So I think that that's kind of an appeal to something that's a bit strange. I don't think we need that appeal. On the contrary, but I do think that that's a bit odd that that's being proposed, and I would agree with you that that's kind of silly. But to ask you a question about that, again, about that paper, because I was misunderstanding you, I suppose, on the BITS paper and this idea of two major variables, the size of the universe and the age of the universe. Is it basically just talking about the probability of any given universe with given traits, given its size and age?
No, it's just you take the total diameter of the volume of the universe and look how many possibilities are there for elementary particles to have positions in this space, in this playground, basically. And then you look how many events could have happened in the time of the universe with this shorted length. The Planck length is this time infinitesimally small, but nothing could happen shorter than the Planck length. That is the kind of atom of time. Shorter times are not possible in physics. So it's the total number of physical events that could happen in the universe unless you inflate the probabilistic resources by multiplying the number of universes.
Right. I would agree with you then. The scenario that we are currently in, sitting here having this conversation, wearing our current t-shirts, is abysmally small, incomprehensibly small. But I would almost point to something you said earlier about the lottery fallacy, where it's like, and yet here we are. So I think that there's again more to it that we could dig into. That changes my mind about the paper that you presented. It sounds quite reasonable. I imagine that number is very small. But the details of it, I think, how that relates to origin of life or fine-tuning arguments, et cetera, we could dig into that a little bit more and say, okay, suppose that it's granted that universes under given conditions result in this set of physical laws. Then how likely is it? And kind of work from there. I think that would be very fun, and I've certainly not done it. But yeah, I mean, I think this has been really cool. Do you want to continue talking?
Yeah.
Or do we take questions, or what would you like to do, and what would you like to do?
I'm open to anything, so we could either move to the Q&A. Maybe the only thing where I would add something, because you said this thing where I would invoke. Have you read Sherlock Holmes once? Or there is this idea in some of the Sherlock Holmes novels that if you have excluded everything that is impossible, then whatever remains must be, how unlikely it may seem, must be the truth. And you invoke this question of you cannot exclude all possible naturalistic alternatives. I would challenge this and think there is a reason why in 2,500 years of Western philosophy and science, Darwin's idea to explain the origin of complex stuff from simple stuff by a bottom-up process of random variation, and then you have this kind of filter of natural or sexual selection. That is the only idea that humans ever came up with to explain the origin of complexity from simplicity without invoking an intelligent agent. And there's a reason why Richard Dawkins said only Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And there's a reason why atheist philosopher Daniel Dennett said it was Darwin's dangerous idea and a universal acid. So it's not like there are dozens of other naturalistic alternatives out there. If Darwinism fails for even mathematical reason, and it's shown that this process, of course, is not total nonsense. Nobody says that. This process certainly is demonstrably active on a certain level. The question is, are there certain limits to the process, or limits of applicability, or can it be universally extrapolated to getting from, as it was recently put in an ID video, to get from bacteria to Beethoven? And that is something that very early Darwin was challenged, that he was extrapolating observable stuff too far. And that is something where I also think that the extrapolation is not really supported by the data. We have good evidence for microevolution. We have good evidence for long periods of time and for common ancestry with transitional forms. But extrapolating that because we can show that, let's say, some stickleback fishes originate in observable time, slightly different population or even species, doesn't explain really how you got a vertebrate eye or sticklebacks in the first place. So I think there are limits to the theory, but the theory will certainly not prove to be totally wrong. I think Darwin's idea is still a brilliant idea, but there are reasons why it is invoked to explain everything, because there are no other alternatives out there. And therefore, I would say this Sherlock Holmes reasoning is not a fallacy. If you have really excluded all other possible alternatives, then intelligent design is the only man standing. And that is something there. It's not really an airtight argument. It's more a gut feeling that I have that this is the case here.
I think that's quite fair. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I really enjoyed similarly my conversation with Dr. Rana, and I appreciate so much about how open you guys are about letting me kind of pick your brains about your thoughts on these kinds of things. because I've been genuinely very curious about like, okay, well, how does this work kind of from your perspective and like all of these different things. And as you mentioned earlier, we seem to agree on like the vast majority of kind of what the reality is and what's parsimonious. It's almost more of a philosophical underpinning that I think that we might differ. And I think that that's kind of what makes like these discussions and what makes science so fun. Is that we get to have these conversations and we get to kind of get into the nitty gritty about where we disagree and why we disagree there. I look forward to, I think science is going to be infinitely more interesting if you're correct, because I think that we get this opportunity to continue to dig in and try to find these answers, and having that motivation of there still are these unknowns is what makes science awesome. And so,
Right.
you could be correct. There may be that, at some point we find support for intelligent design, or rather, and I think this would be the much more taking a long time version, but we rule out all of the possibilities from a naturalistic perspective. I'm of the opinion that that won't happen, but I'm certainly not closed-minded to the idea of it. I just am, I am just trying to make sense of the data that surrounds me today, and I do feel that evolution by natural selection has kind of the upper hand on that for the time being. But that being said, I think that this was just so much fun. I think that this was just an absolute blast. And I
Jamie,
thank you
also
so much.
enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you. And actually, when we have finished this manuscript on whale origins, then we can certainly include you in the list of let's say, early reviewers who will get the manuscript to critical thing. Because actually, I don't care if I'm right or not. If ultimately it should turn out that Darwinism is true, I have no problem with it, and I also have no theological problems with it. Even as a Christian, I have no problem. I don't interpret Genesis in any literalistic way. I think that's silly. And so, if the evidence is, let's say, against, should ultimately show intelligent design is wrong, it's okay. So I very much appreciate your open approach to just look at more evidence that is coming in, and then ultimately, hopefully, the evidence will converge to some preferable hypothesis. We will see.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it, right? Is that like we're both just here to try to figure out what the heck is going on, and that's why it's fun.
Cool. All right. We can take some questions now. I'd like to say I'm honored to have organized this discussion. It's such a pleasure seeing two academics having this discussion rather than what you often see on the internet where two people quickly degenerates into hurling insults. I mean, some of this was over my head, but maybe I'll catch more of it when I listen to it back when I'm not running the stream. So here's the first question. This came in quite early on for Dr. Bechly from TD Lane. What about Synapsids? They preserve distinct features between non-mammalian synapsids and mammals, including the gentry, I don't know how to say this name's jaw layout in here.
Yes, the dentition and the middle ear. So that is, yeah.
So they're asking you, what about it in regards to your thesis?
Yeah, I have no problem with it. I think it's certainly evidence for common ancestry. So that you have these intermediate forms where you can see that the dentition was transitioning from some kind of more structure where you have similar looking teeth to a more differentiation of different teeth as you have it in modern mammals, where you have then cheek teeth and canines and so on. All this, what Erika has shown in her presentation, these intermediate forms showing the change of the primary articulation of the dental to the bones of the ear. That's certainly valid evidence for common ancestry. But the question is, how did these transitions come about? How did the new information that was necessary for many of these transitions, certainly not for all of them, some of them certainly can be explained with naturalistic processes if they don't involve too much complexity, specified complexity. But some of these transformations, in my view, require infusion of information from outside of the system.
All right, and the next one, they're all for Günter Bechly, it seems like. Dear Gunter, do you think that the terrestrial, I'm not going to pronounce these names, priapulids are also an important piece of evidence for intelligent design?
The terrestrial what?
The preapolids. I think they're referring to
the penis worms, or
yeah.
I think priapolids are certainly evidence for intelligent design, but I don't even know about terrestrial priapolids. I've never seen terrestrial ones. I think they are exclusively marine invertebrates. They are among the phyla that appear suddenly in the Cambrian explosion. So they are among the Burgess shale fauna, for example. Also in Shenyang, we have in China, we have priapolids, which basically look like modern ones. So they are among these early body plans of bilaterian animals that appear in this event in the Cambrian. And but terrestrial priapolids I never heard about. If they would exist, then maybe they would even be more evidence for intelligent design. But I doubt that there are terrestrial priapolids.
Okay, next one. Dr. Bechly, you've said a lot about Darwinism and neo-Darwinism. Could you describe modern evolutionary theory in 2021?
Yeah, of course. So the claim behind the question, of course, is, well, we have left behind Darwinism long ago, and now we have the not only the modern synthesis, but maybe the extended synthesis with all this stuff, neutral evolution according to Kimura, and Evo-Devo and niche construction and phenotypic plasticity and natural genetic engineering, and name it. The problem is the following. All these other approaches either have nothing to do with closing these explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism, which is more and more becoming not just a controversial idea, but a mainstream consensus among mainstream evolutionary theoretical biologists that neo-Darwinism cannot explain these phenomena. These other alternatives either do not even address the question, how does phenotypic complexity arise? For example, niche construction is nice, that the beaver has some kind of interaction with his dam, and that there is a feedback from the beaver dam to the evolution of the body. But this doesn't explain how you get a vertebrate eye or hair or whatever. The other part of these theories ultimately require neo-Darwinism to explain their own origin. So if you take phenotypic plasticity or so-called evolvability, that is nice as soon as you have it, but they are in a way a kind of pre-programming for evolvability. And how did this originate? And then you get this kind of Münchhausen problem. You need something else to explain the origin of these phenomena. And they ultimately require then neo-Darwinism, random mutation, natural selection to explain how they came about. And if this mechanism is refuted by these kind of arguments like the waiting time problem, then they are dead in the water and cannot explain these explanatory deficits either. So, of course, modern evolutionary theory includes a lot of different phenomena, but none of these, I would claim, solves the deficits of neo-Darwinism. And you need, basically, as I said, there is a reason why it was only Darwin who made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. We have no other mechanism to explain how we get complexity from simplicity by a natural, stepwise, bottom-up process.
Erika, do you want to comment on any of these?
I mean, I'm just listening and enjoying Gunter's responses to that. I mean, I think that, and I've said this quite a bit, that I think there's simply more to it than that from my perspective. I mean, when you get into kind of the more modern perspective of paleontology and kind of how that works with evolutionary theory and genetics, I mean, it really is kind of this combination of multiple different things that leads us to the conclusion of this naturally evolved series of lineages. And I think that it's all fine and good to say, okay, well, we've got this waiting time problem with the cetaceans, and I really am looking for the paper because I don't know very much about cetaceans, but I can't help but wonder if it's going to be a case again of something that is kind of resolved down the line when taking into account these more modern mechanisms and being able to get a richer data set like what we see with the hominins, and that kind of applying that to the cetaceans. And Gunter, he says the data set is quite rich, and for all I know it is. I'm just, until I see it, I'm more kind of agnostic to the paper and as I'm sure he understands. But yeah, I mean, we kind of mentioned this earlier, but there's almost like something of a bit of a philosophical difference here, because I don't see much of a problem with taking the smaller scale changes and applying them to the large scale, particularly if we see these certain clues in genetics and then the likes of the fossil record. But it remains to be seen. There are certainly questions that one can ask, and the one that Gunter's asking about cetaceans is an interesting one.
All right, and we'll go to the next one from Creation Myths for Dr. Bechly. Would a novel photosynthetic organelle evolution of de novo multicellular or evolution of placentas de novo count as macro evolution? Because we've observed all that.
Yes, there have been, let's say, experimental origins of multicellularity with even some kind of differentiation of tissue, kind of differentiate between the reproductive cells and non-reproductive body cells. The question is the following: it is certainly evidence for some kind of macroevolution. The question is this sufficient to explain everything, or is it just one phenomenon among others that can be explained naturalistically? And that doesn't mean that all phenomena can be explained naturalistically. Nobody doubts that there are certain phenomena in biology that can be explained without invoking intelligent design. It doesn't necessarily exclude intelligent design, but there we at least have no evidence, and have pretty convincing evidence that it's possible with an unguided process. For example, let's say speciation on the alpha taxonomical level certainly is possible with neo-Darwinian processes. And this origin of multicellularity does not necessarily involve the creation of any kind of new information. It is just, it could even happen without changing the genome significantly at all, because many bacteria can aggregate anyway and can form some kind of filaments. And then you of course also have some kind of epigenetic processes that can assist in building up these kind of differentiated quasi-multicellular structures. So it depends really. Looking in these particular cases, I would agree that some of these experiments show some kind of macroevolution, but I don't find them in any way convincing a solution to the problems like the origin of animal body plans in the Cambrian explosion, or how did bird feathers originate. But we didn't talk about bird feathers. That's another a very interesting thing where we have a very narrow window of time, but that's actually the next paper we will look into. And there, depending on your threshold, because some of the paleontological evidence, because it's not all of the fossils are complete, and there is some evidence for theropods, for the older ones, which is only based on teeth, where there is some controversy. Are they really theropods or not? Or could there be homoplasy involved in the tooth characters? So depending on your threshold, you will get a window of time available of 1 to 7 million years for the origin of a pennaceous bird feather from a filamentous precursor structure that we find in dinosaurs like Sinosauropteryx. And there we will have a similar time window as in human evolution. And there is some evidence, and that is something that I recently came across, which is totally independent from simulation and complex mathematical stuff. There is a very nice website on the internet called timetree.org, where you can do calculations based on molecular clock. You can just enter two organisms, let's say a cow and a chicken, and look how long ago did they separate these lineages. I challenge any Darwinist or Erika, or just look into this program and find me any kind of pair of living organisms that are separated on the realm, let's say 5 million years, which would be the window of time available between Pachycetus and Basilosaurus to get from a pig-like ancestor to a marine whale, to find any pair of species that had even remotely a comparable level of morphological difference. If you look at it, it's usually 5 million years is pairs of species that look even indistinguishable to the layman, like two species of warblers that one is a little bit more green above the eye and the other a little bit more yellow, and they are separated 7 million years ago according to molecular clock. You can take anything what you want in any group of organisms. You will not find a single pair of organisms that have this level of divergence, even though they could theoretically even have the double amount of divergence, because you have two recent species that have both diverged from a common ancestor. So there were two lineages where they could accumulate differences, while in the case from an ancestral organism to a descendant organism, you just have one lineage where differences could accumulate. So the fact that we don't find any example in the recent realm where in these time windows similar changes were achieved according to mainstream dating and mainstream data on molecular clocks gives me some reason to pause. So, Erika, what is your comment on this argument?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I think morphologic change, as categorized by human eyes and our ability to group them, is quite different from genetic change. As I said with hominid evolution, we seem on the outset quite different from chimpanzees, and yet some of our most obviously different traits, like for instance the fact that our hair is vellus hair and is quite fine, is dictated by very few genetic changes. So I would be interested in looking into cetaceans and seeing, gosh, I wish we could have those ancient genomes, because that would really solve a lot of the problem, wouldn't it? Because we'd be able to actually look at the differences that are at play here. I think I alluded to this earlier, but this concept of incredible environmental pressure for these whales, particularly with the marine reptiles wiped clean from the slate, adds an additional layer of strength to the pressure that would be like, hey, all of a sudden, there's all of this opportunity to exploit and we find this in the bone densities and in the isotopic ratios of the bones for the likes of Ambulocetus and Tachycetus and Dorodon, as we move from these more freshwater habitats into estuaries with the salt and freshwater mix and into the open sea. So I think that you've got these interesting pressures that are at play, combined with the idea of how much genetic change are we looking at really? And I don't have the answer to that. I can only speak with analogy to the hominids. I think it would be quite interesting to kind of get in, again, and I keep saying this, to get into the weeds there, because I wonder if it's as dramatic as it seems, because you're correct. I mean, and no one would disagree that the difference between Indohyus, this small hoofed artiodactyl animal, and Basilosaurus, one of the largest cetaceans of all time, is quite large. How much is really changing there? I don't know. I think that another thing that you touched on that I would like to kind of mention is this concept of we talked about the multicellularity in the lab, right? So exposure to predation pressure, and all of a sudden, you get these organisms that group together, and when they reproduce, they also again grow to group together. So it's this proposed evolution of multicellularity. And I read the paper, and I think it's quite robust. It's very interesting, the types of lineages that kind of adapted in this fashion. And for me, that raised an interesting question that I would kind of have for you, or kind of an impression that I got that is maybe a bit silly, or I hope it's not a mischaracterization. But to me, the multicellularity jump was one of the biggies, right? This is one of the things that when we look at evolutionary theory, it's like, okay, well, we've got abiogenesis, we've got the proto-eukaryotic transition, we've got multicellularity, we've got the Cambrian explosion, the transition to land, the transition of mammals, birds, theropod, dinosaurs to birds, et cetera, et cetera. There are these big leaps that we tend to characterize as insurmountable, that as we find out more about them, they become something, in my opinion, of very surmountable. And I find it interesting that making this jump and showing multicellularity in a lab isn't, I guess, more compelling to you, because it's like, to me, that sense a larger jump, right? That is was previously unjumpable. So I almost feel like, from your perspective, like to really prove to you that yes, Darwinian evolution, as we understand it, is possible, that you would have to see all step by step. Like, oh yes, here from a lab, we're going from a single cellular organism to all extant life, and then that would be like, yes, this has convinced me.
The reason why I don't find it convincing is that, and that is now easy to say after the fact because you cannot really prove that it's the case, but I would never have used multicellularity, let's say, as an intelligent design argument, because I find if you look at the case that multicellularity first appears in different lineages. So we have it in green plants, we have it in fungi, we have it in animals, we have it in brown algae, and we even have it on a simple level on some bacterial associations. So I don't find it meeting the criteria for intelligent design in terms of a sufficient degree of specified complexity and of unlikelihood of the pattern matching an independent pattern. I wouldn't say it's trivial, but it's not invoking some kind of complex new structure of new genetic information, necessity of new protein folds, or it's an association of pre-existing cells where you have some differentiation that, as I said, could be based on more epigenetic, or seems even to be based on more epigenetic mechanisms than genetic changes. And therefore, I don't find this, let's say, compelling as an example. Oh, macroevolution, large jumps can happen in quick time. I don't find it meeting the criteria for complexity.
May I ask, out of pure curiosity, what are your thoughts on like Hox genes? Like, Neil Shubin is very big on. I'm sure you've read your Inner Fish, the book that he kind of goes over, or Some Assembly Required, one of his books where he, for laymen like me, kind of breaks it down what these changes kind of look like body plan wise. And I found his representation of like Sonic Hedgehog for digit development to be very interesting. This idea of it's simply a patch. I believe it was like vitamin A, one of the essential vitamins. That's the patches for specific duration is what's going to determine the length of the limb, the number of the digits, where that's expressed is going to determine the digits that grow to specific lengths, et cetera, et cetera. And they've done some cool experiments where they take the patch and they mimic it on like a chicken embryo, and then it ends up with two little primary digits there. So I was just curious, as from your perspective, how you kind of feel about that.
Yeah, the Hox gene is certainly interesting. They can explain some instances. Let's say if you have something like segmentation, and you have the repetition of the same segments as you have in arthropods. And also, if you look at eye development or development of limbs in limb-like appendages in different organisms, that Hox genes are involved in the origin of these structures. There are two problems, though. One problem is that only because you have this kind of module-like Lego brick system, which you can combine in different ways, doesn't mean that if you combine them, that you get viable new types of body plans. This also hasn't been achieved in laboratory experiments. You get some kind of strange effects, but you don't get new body plans. This includes a lot of, let's say, interaction between different parts that have to function together to get a viable new construction. It's not like you can just switch some Hox genes and you get an arthropod from an unsegmented worm or something, a viable arthropod. The other problem is that this whole approach assumes that you could make changes on the body plan level without significant new genetic information. No new genes or new protein folds are necessary. It's just you recombine the Lego bricks, and these originated somewhere in the Archean, in the Precambrian, and then for some reasons from external factors, snowball Earth or whatever, these Lego bricks were then recombined in the Cambrian explosion and constructed all these different body plans. It turns out that was in criticism, for example, by Charles Marshall when Steve Meyer published his book Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, that he said, well, these Cambrian explosion thing, this didn't even require new information. We had all the Hox genes already, and they just had to use to construct something new. Meanwhile, it has been shown by empirical data by mainstream evolutionists, for example, the paper by Paps and Holland, that for each of the major transitions, for all of the body plans that originated in the Cambrian, there were new genes necessary, and there were new proteins necessary. You can even identify the proteins that you can assign to the different nodes in the branching of the tree. So it's not sufficient to have the Hox genes. You also need all the major genetic changes and the new proteins combined with the Hox gene changes to then get a viable new body plan. And there I haven't seen any experimental result that even remotely makes it plausible that this could originate, let's say, spontaneously or even by a Darwinian process of natural selection.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting. And I don't want to mischaracterize you. I almost get the vibe that it's like the Cambrian explosion is like a big one for you, and then coming out from the Cambrian explosion, doing things like developing digits or limbs, for that matter, is more trivial and less of a large scale change. Would that be correct?
No. I would say it is included in the Cambrian explosion. It's included in the origin of these different body plans, but it's not sufficient. It's embedded in this whole process of having new proteins, having new genes, having new functional information in the genome that is specifying the interaction of different parts of these complex different body plans. And maybe for the listeners who probably are not all biologists, explain that these different body plans, for example, are then an arthropod who is hard outside and soft inside, or a vertebrate who is hard inside and soft outside. So these very different constructions, their Hox genes are involved, but I would suggest that they are involved in a coordinated way with many other changes that, to me, rather suggest some kind of intelligent process, or at least infusion of information from outside of the system. That is how I would define intelligent design.
I think you're totally correct on that. There's likely going to have to be, at least in some cases, a relationship between just the limb itself and other body systems. But I would propose, kind of to the contrary, that typically, like the concept of precursor mutations, that you're not going to get the whole set together unless all the mutations are present. And in many cases, at least in laboratory work, on their own, sometimes these mutations don't do anything. It's not until they're in the combination with everything else that they can take hold and really be selected for. And I think that your characterization too about how we're getting all of these, for lack of a better term, like abominations, where you've got these animals that are they have these quite strange body plans that certainly don't appear to be lending them a fitness benefit in the case of what we're doing in the lab, giving chickens the two digits or messing with the skate and giving it these strange body plans. And I would agree with you that these organisms would be selected against. My proposal to the contrary would be that it is that selection against these organisms that are unviable, combined with the fact that they were there in the first place, that we can have them occur in the first place, that suggests that the moment that we get something that is a fitness benefit, it is just going to take hold like wildfire. It's like a vice grip. All of a sudden it's like, look at this is a huge benefit. And that indeed drives selection in pretty much everywhere else. I mean, it's the classic example that tends to come up is, we see the emergence or diversification rather of all these different arthropod body forms with the emergence of the eye, right? So it's like all of a sudden when you can see what you're hunting for, body armor becomes this massive benefit because it's not just bumping into critters that you're trying to eat. You're actively hunting and then you actively need defense. So I think, that a lot of this is just irreparably entwined with one another. And indeed, we're probably seeing a lot of organisms that are having bad combinations and bad times throughout history. I mean, every now and again, we do indeed see that today. Organisms with strange mutations in the wild or in the laboratory, less so in the wild because we're not always out there looking. And sometimes they take hold and sometimes they don't. A great example is in, I think it's in North America. I believe it's in Canada. It couldn't be America as well, up in the Pacific Northwest, maybe. But you get these populations of the proposed sea wolves, right? There are these wolves with very webbed feet, more so than any other wolves. And, many dogs have webbed aspects to their feet, but in the case of the wolves, it's really taken hold. And as a result, or perhaps prior to, as an incentive for, these guys have a hugely fish-based diet and aquatic life-based diet. So, these things often tumble in tandem with one another. And while so I agree with your premise, I guess I just take a different, more optimistic outlook on it and suggest that the hopeful monster really isn't so much out of our grasp, considering the sample size we're dealing with.
I would actually agree that if you could show, let's say, that these precursor mutations are likely enough that you could achieve these kind of, let's say, saltational changes where then selection would kick in and positively select for these organisms, then this would be much more plausible to me. The problem is that if you look at the, let's say, these other paths, like the origin of new proteins, that there is other research that suggests that these, if you look at this combinatorial search space to get proteins, which are built up by amino acids, where you have about 20 different amino acids, and they combine like letters in an alphabet, and you could say, well, sentences is something analogous to proteins. The problem is not every protein does anything in biology. They have to fold in some kind of three-dimensional structure to be biologically active. And it turns out that if you look at this combinatorial search space of all possible combination of amino acids of different strings, lengths of strings, that these islands of functions where you get functional protein folds are so isolated that it's not like you could move from A to B by just tiny steps, where every step would have to have at least some tiny selective advantage, because evolution has no foresight and can say, hey, let's make 50 neutral mutations in the right direction, because then we will get some selective effect. If islands of function are separated in this search space so widely that you would require, let's say, some hundred of proper mutation at the same time, at the same place, in the same organism, then again, that is hard to explain with anything that is remotely similar to a Darwinian process. Maybe this research is wrong, but this has to be demonstrated. So if there is protein research coming up that shows that you could get from A to B, and that islands of function are much more frequent. There have been attempts, for example, that said, well, we can get functional proteins from random sequences. But actually, if you look at the papers that made these claims, the function that turned out to be in these proteins were not like anything like biological functions of protein folds. It was these proteins were sticky. They stick together. That's not really what we mean with protein folds having a biological function. So I have seen no convincing research that new protein folds can originate with anything like a Darwinian process, and they have to originate with these new body plans. And therefore, I think these precursor mutations would be nice, but they must be possible, and I don't see that.
Yeah, I think my very light pushback on that would be that oftentimes it doesn't take 25 plus mutations. Oftentimes it can be 1 or 2 or even 3 that are quite yeah, and so I would propose that, and I again, once we get into the further and further back in time, I tend to know less about the organisms. Once you get into the akin, for example, and all of that stuff is pretty wild to me. But a lot of the body plans and a lot of the adaptations that we see in organisms, at least kind of from the Ordovician onwards, after the Great Ordovician Biodiversity event onward, you tend to see quite a bit of very evident adaptation on previous structure. And while I would agree that you do have to have these systems in tandem oftentimes, I think that by their very nature of being tied together, they tend to mutate as one as well. At least that's what I see, in my kind of limited area, that these things tend to occur sometimes in a mosaic fashion, but sometimes not. And usually, if they're not irreparably tied, they can occur mosaically, as in bipedality and large brain size in the hominids. I mean, it used to be that we expected everything to be a perfect mosaic moving upwards, but it turns out it does indeed occur before the other oftentimes, and it's whichever provides the fitness benefit in that exact moment. So I would be curious again, that's just like my light pushback on that. Because I guess I'm simply not as incredulous.
That's fair enough, and I think that is something that can be solved. So I would be open to the research that is coming in the next probably 10 years. This should be solved because we make much more progress in terms of experimental genetics and experiments in the realm of Evo-Devo. So I think this will not be an open question for too long. And if these problems will not be solved 10 years from now or 20 years from now, and different approaches to let's say, alternatives to the Darwinian mechanism have not shown to solve the problems, then let's talk again. And if they have been solved, then so much the better. Science and intelligent design proponents get a new job. We will see. So.
I think that's a perfect way of looking at it. I mean, we can only work with the data that we've got, and short of that, it's a bit of speculation on everyone's part. So. And
there is something because it's often said, as I alluded to, God of the gaps argument. There's of course the opposite as well, the kind of naturalism of the gaps, that even for problems that haven't been solved for a long time, and where you get the impression maybe there's something with this problem that it is not solvable by this mechanism in principle, there is this attempt, give us 100 more years or 200 more years, we have achieved so much in the past years, then we will find something. But I would say, well, that is just the opposite side of the coin, and is a kind of naturalism of the gaps. We can, of course, make some extrapolations on the data we do have and say, make an inference to the best explanation, which can turn out to be wrong with more data coming in, and then maybe intelligent design turns out to be the currently, for me, more elegant explanation, but maybe ultimately wrong explanation. Or the same happens with neo-Darwinism. That's something where we all should be open to let the data speak.
I think that's so key, and I put that in my intro because I feel so strongly about it. You know, we work with the data that we've got, and as new data comes in, the wonderful thing about science is that we can and should change our mind as more data comes to the surface. So I will put a pin in it and talk in 10 years and see what happens.
Right.
This particular point I find interesting because skeptics will say skepticism is a virtue unless it's something they want to believe, and then they call it, faith in science or something like that. But then, they flip it over when they're talking to theists and they say, oh, you just have faith, you're too credulous, you should have some more skepticism.
Yeah, we got to be consistent,
Right. Actually, that is something where I very much appreciate many of the videos that Erika has done, because if we look, let's say, at Young Earth Creationists, the problem is that they are not open to the evidence. They know in advance Genesis, and their particular interpretation of Genesis is correct. And whatever evidence comes in has to be reinterpreted in a way to make it fit with their preconceived narrative. And that, of course, even if it would be ultimately true, is certainly not how science is done. So there is certainly a point of agreement between us to say, well, that's not science and that's not how we should do it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that ability to be able to change your mind, and even scientists have a tough time with this. I mean, you get some folks who really white knuckle their hypothesis, their pet hypothesis, and just have to be dragged, kicking, screaming into the scientific. Hey, this isn't going to work. And it's
that is
important.
a nice ideal that scientists are always open to falsify their theories and love nothing more than challenging their own thoughts. That is how it should be. But the reality, of course, is that most scientists are in love with their theories and they hate other scientists who try to refute their theories. So there are issues also playing a role, of course.
Oh, yeah. And I can get really sassy. I was surprised upon entering graduate school and really getting, my kind of teeth into academia, reading some of the comments and papers going in tandem with one another. And I was like, these people are really sassy to each other when it's right down to it. No one wants their pet hypothesis thrown out and will just, really fight to the death for that. And I was like, I can sympathize. I really can. But at the same time, it's like, man, and maybe I'm a hypocrite. Maybe someday I'll have my own pet hypothesis that I just don't want to let go of. But it seems like I'm young and not yet jaded. And it's like, oh well, why can't we all just be willing to throw up our hands when the data proves us wrong and reassess? But it's like easier said than done.
That's why Max Planck said something like, "Scientific revolutions happen one funeral at a time."
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that too. Yeah, I have heard that too.
It's nice to see you two are so open-minded. This is lovely. Maybe we can try to quick fire through the last couple questions.
Sure.
Creation myths again for Dr. Bechly. Neme et al. 2017 documented widespread biochemical functionality from random polymerization of RNAs and amino acids. Why doesn't that refute ID claim of intelligence required for functional information?
Yeah, because if you look at the detailed case, and I'm not a molecular biologist, I'm really on the undergraduate level of knowledge of genetics and molecular biology. So I've looked in some of the cases. In all the cases that I have looked in, it turned out that the claim that there is really complex new information turned out simply to be not true and to be vastly exaggerated. So as I just have mentioned, these proteins that originate from random sequences and allegedly have function, then turned out the function was being sticky, which usually is present in most proteins. So if there are cases, show them to me, but I haven't seen any examples where something like this did originate. And in most cases where new stuff originated in the lab, it turned out that it's either recombination of information that was pre-existing, information that had, and it is more complex, as Erika said, but which was basically not active and then had to be activated, or which is transferred by horizontal gene transfer, by viruses, or which is simply degrading existing information, which can also be advantageous. So an organism can, for example, become resistant against a poison if it loses the function to metabolize the poison, and therefore the poison just runs through it without having any effect on the body. So deactivating a pre-existing gene can mimicking a new function, a complex new function, even though it didn't involve any kind of new information on a level, let's say, of complexity higher than these 500-bit level. So I have seen no example of this. If you have one, I'm looking into it for sure.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, what do you make of the ice fish, the de novo protein in the ice fish?
I've read about it. I haven't looked into it. What is really the new protein? Is there a precursor of the protein? I don't know. I cannot say anything about this. I've read the reports about this research of these anti-freezing proteins in ice fish, but have no knowledge about it.
To my knowledge, it's being entirely sorry. I was just going to say, to my knowledge, it's being proposed as entirely de novo from what I've read on the paper. Okay. And I'm unsure though, kind of the progress that they've made on that. You might just look into it. You might find it interesting. And because I think what makes it such a good example, I think, is because it's not even in a lab; it's in the wild, which is cool. Anyway.
That's true. Yeah, I will definitely look into the ice fish protein. That sounds interesting.
I
thought it was cool. Biochem gets, it starts getting, the biochem and the genetics start getting a little above my head, and then I'm looking up definitions, and it becomes a multi-hour ordeal to really digest the paper. But that one I did read. I
already have the paper on my PC as PDF because I usually download such new stuff. But as you know, there's so much out there. You usually don't read everything that's coming out. So
the backlog grows and grows, and before you know it, you're like getting new papers from 2017.
You guys can put comments down in the comment section, and if you got answers for any of Günter Bechly's challenges, I can be sure he hears about them. Another question from CJ. What observation is incompatible with the design hypothesis that isn't shifting the burden, i.e. asking to prove that things aren't designed, or question begging?
Let me see what observation is incompatible with. Oh, okay. So the claim would be that the design hypothesis is compatible with anything. So in a way, God could have done it any way he wanted, and therefore there's no possible observation that refutes the design hypothesis. That's not true, because the design claim is explicitly that you have certain features in a system, certain patterns, which first meet the unlikelihood. You could refute this. You could show, well, this kind of mutation is not as unlikely as you thought. And second, this independently matching pattern, like for example, the matching of the genetic code with amino acids and proteins ultimately. If you have these two criteria, you can basically refute both. It's not like we could look at any kind of pattern and would come with the hypothesis that's designed. No, the design inference clearly distinguishes between phenomena that are reasonably explained by either chance or necessity or a combination thereof. And if it is possible to explain it with that, I also agree with Erika that in those cases, I would prefer the naturalistic explanation, not because it's necessarily the true one, but for parsimony reasons. And I also think that methodological naturalism is a reasonable approach in the experimental sciences. And I think there is a fundamental differences in experimental research and in something like evolutionary biology, which is in many parts, or if not in most parts, not experimental, but rather a historical science to reconstruct the past. And the difference is the following. In experimental sciences, you have repeatable phenomena which have then a pattern that you can mathematically model, you can make predictions, and this property of being able to be modeled mathematically means you can compress this information that is in there into a mathematical formula. This is typical for natural phenomena. It is not typical for activity of an intelligent agent that you can predict the outcome based on a mathematical algorithm. If we look at historical sciences, we are dealing with singular phenomena that cannot be repeated and that cannot be predicted on a basis of a mathematical algorithm. And that is typical for activities of an intelligent agent. It is not necessarily it's not necessarily caused by an intelligent agent, but it fits very well with an intelligent agent. Therefore, I think this alternative of intelligent design is very reasonable in the historical sciences, and therefore reasonable in forensics and history and archaeology and evolutionary biology or cosmology. And there is a reason why there is no intelligent design chemistry or intelligent design optics, because there we have these mathematically modeling phenomena that don't require an intelligent agent. So it's not true that all phenomena would be welcomed by intelligent design proponents and be explained with ID. That's not the case.
Another one for Dr. Bechly. Are you aware of Hox genes? They're responsible for... Oh, hang on. Is that the first part of it?
Yeah, we already talked about the Hox genes. So, yeah. But people, be polite. Ask some question to Erika.
I think we've
never get any questions. It makes me so sad.
I think we've got a lot of Erika's audience here, and they're going after the anti-evolution side.
Okay. I'm fine with that.
I want, I was promoting the show. I wanted people to come, and I, they've
yeah, that's
out.
good. I did too. So I think we're spreading the news.
Many changes in synapsid mammalian line are controlled by Hox genes. Don't require new information on the existing. Have you commented on this already?
Yeah, and I would add, if it is the case that these changes can be explained without intelligent design, fine. I don't claim that every kind of change in the history of life has to be explained with intelligent design. I'm totally okay with having some phenomena being totally natural in origin.
I think the objection is kind of like, just saying that we don't have an evolution explanation. It's like, well, you're just going to say God did it, we call it design. So, if
that would be the gaps claim, but as I said, the difference is that you don't just invoke, we have all these other instances which we cannot explain naturalistically, which we cannot explain with Hox genes, but these other phenomena have a certain structure where we can make a positive argument based on our knowledge of the causal mechanisms in our universe. What kind of effects can be produced by which kind of causes? So I have no problem with some phenomena in the history of life being mechanistically explainable. It's the same in history, only because some phenomena in history require, let's say, an intelligent agent, doesn't mean that there are certain dynamics in history that are more or less automatical in the development of societies, and that don't invoke a kind of planning by an intelligent agent who said, well, let's make a war against those people, but where you have these kind of self-enforcing mechanisms in the history of humankind. The one doesn't exclude the other, and you have to look at every particular case and on the evidence that is presented for each case in terms of causal mechanisms.
You want to comment on?
Yeah, I think that's fair. It boils down to a question of how do we know the difference? Like I don't think Gunter, like Gunter just said, he would not propose that everything is the result of tinkering, that necessarily some things are and some things aren't. And from my perspective, it's more like, okay, I'm interested. Tell me more. I want to know the difference. How do we break it down and look at which ones are and which ones aren't? And it's going to be interesting, kind of where the ID proponents go in kind of outlining a set of criteria. I'll be interested to see how that develops.
Right.
All right. From Daper Dino, what makes Dr. Bechly think that I can't pronounce that Sinosauropteryx or its contemporaries evolved in any animal in aviali? Help me with that.
Okay.
Pronunciation.
So first, I don't think that we evolved into, because that would claim that we know that Sinosauropteryx is on the ancestral lineage rather than a side branch. And for most cases, I would say for 99% of the cases, it's a matter of the methodology that we cannot in principle identify ancestor-descendant relationships, but only side branches. Because
I would tend to, oh shoot, we froze here for a second.
You're fine.
I started talking and then everything froze and I was like, oh no, they're just no one's gonna hear me and it's gonna seem like I just interrupted. I would totally agree. I think there's a huge misunderstanding that folks who aren't involved in paleontology or tangential fields tend to come up with, and this is especially grievous in human evolution, pop science, is this idea that something directly begets something else. Like, this new species is the ancestor of humans. That cannot be said in the vast majority of cases unless we get actual genetic material, which is quite rare. We can indeed take suites of characteristics and say, based off of these suites of characteristics, are the common ancestor between us and chimpanzees likely to look very similar to this, if not this organism, something quite close. Or the path would likely look something like this given these organisms we have along the line. Very commonly the question of, is it Australopithecus afarensis or Australopithecus africanus that is the direct relative of Homo sapiens? And my answer to that is always, I don't know, and I don't think it matters. They're quite similar. They both have derived and basal characteristics, and it is these suites of characteristics in both categories that we were trying to assess in order to see what the plausible stepwise evolution would have looked like, not who the particular characters were. So I think that's always an important distinction.
Right. I would make the case even stronger and say that's why I said it's in principle not possible. And the reason has to do with a method that is used in modern phylogenetic research called cladistics, and the type of characters that we use to identify certain lineage, that is called synapomorphies, or the shared derived characteristics. So if you wanted to have a kind of label in terms of character that identifies an ancestor, then this would have to be a characteristic that is exclusive to the ancestor. But that cannot be, because the ancestor gives all its characteristics to its descendants. So it can in principle have no apomorphies, no particular characters that are only special to the ancestor, not to the descendants. And therefore, if you have characteristics that differ, then it's a side branch. If they're lacking, you have an organism that could be on a side branch and you just lack the information that would identify the side branch, or it could be an ancestor, but we cannot identify it positively. So that is one thing. If the question should have been more general, why do I think that Sinosauropteryx has anything to do with birds, or in terms of, let's say, common ancestry hypothesis. It's based on this hierarchical distribution of character similarities, like the leg skeleton with this fusion of the tarsus, metatarsus, or the presence of these strange structures of the skin, which are different from other organisms and uniquely similar to birds and these feathered dinosaurs or filamentous dinosaurs. So there are simply characters that are similarities most elegantly explained in terms of this kind of tree-like relationship.
So I've got, now we know why we're not getting questions for Erika. She's got a YouTube channel and she does live streams. People get their questions through to her.
Luckily, I can just dip in and give my 2 cents whenever Gunter answers a question. I can just butt in and
sure.
Yeah, that's what you're here for. Yeah. Cool. More questions from Creation Myths. We've observed that the evolution of things that meet criteria of irreducible complexity. Why doesn't that refute irreducible complexity? For example, new biochemical function in HIV. And when I say
again, I have to say I have not seen any example personally that, for me, fulfilled these criteria of irreducible complexity. So one of the famous examples, of course, is this bacterioflagellum or other of these molecular machines, where you have a structure that is consistent, let's say, of 40 proteins. And even though in the case of the flagellum, there is a structure which has about 20 proteins, which is serving as a kind of injection apparatus, the type 3 secretion apparatus, which you could say, well, it's not that you need all the proteins to have the function. The problem is, how do you get from A to B again? So if you take these 40 proteins and you take 1 away, it doesn't work. If you take 2 away, it doesn't work. If you take 3 away, it doesn't work. If you take 4 away, it doesn't work. But if you take 20 away, you can arrange it in a way that you have a different function. The problem is, how do you bridge this gap with the Darwinian process? And that is an idea. It's not like intelligent design proponents came up with this objection. That is based on a point that Darwin made himself in The Origin of Species, where he said, if you could find any kind of organ that could not be built up by a addition of small stepwise changes, then my theory would completely break down. And ID proponents simply picked up this suggestion by Darwin. How could you falsify the theory and try to identify such structures in the realm, for example, of molecular machines? So if you have these examples, there are 2 points. First, only because some structures where we superficially first thought that they are irreducibly complex turned out not to be irreducibly complex, does not imply that all structures that look irreducibly complex and where we have very good arguments, empirical arguments that they are irreducibly complex, that they are not either. So you cannot say because we have shown one case where something that looks irreducible complex is not refutes the whole argument. You have to look at every point for itself. But actually, I haven't seen any kind of structure where you have this irreducible complexity originating de novo, not being based on something that was present already in the genome of the population, and then just required some minor change or some recombination of pre-existing information or horizontal transfer of pre-existing information. If you want to look at most of these cases, there's a recent book by Michael Behe of ID fame called Darwin Devolves, which discusses all these cases of alleged new function, new information originating in the lab, and showing that they are all based on kind of devolution, regressive evolution of pre-existing information rather than really origination of new complex information. But I cannot say anything to this particular case. I have no clue what he's talking about, so I have to leave this case open and can look into it.
But the
I
internet
think
atheists hurl a whole lot of insults at Michael Behe, so why should we read his book?
Who threw insults to Michael Behe?
The internet atheists hurl insults at all these authors you're quoting. Why should we care what they have to say when people are hurling insults at them on the internet?
Oh, okay. So I think everybody should look at the arguments and not be influenced by insults or anything else. So that would be the genetic policy.
It's always good to address the arguments rather than do some ad homing. I think we can all agree with that, at least on this panel. With regard to kind of what Creationist was just saying, I suppose, from my perspective, I would push back and say, also not being of biochemical academic background, sort of just taking biochemistry, the organic chemistries and the inorganic chemistries in undergrad. So my knowledge is just enough to comprehend some of the papers that they put out. But one of the things that I think is quite interesting is it's a lot easier for me. My father's a doctor. I come from a medical background in that aspect, and I'm very interested in anatomy and physiology as well. And used to be on the pre-veterinary path, so all of that interests me quite a bit, organs and organ systems. And very frequently when organs and organ systems are being proposed, aspects of them are being proposed as irreducibly complex, there's quite a bit more work on it, and I can comprehend it quite a bit easier. And usually there's a large literature base that at the very least proposes potential pathways, if not definitive ones, which again, very similar to the direct ancestry thing. I don't think we can ever say this is how something definitively did evolve or didn't. It's more providing, could it have? Do we have a plausible path? And at least in the case of the macroscopic stuff, I find that there is less and less ID conversation about it because we tend to learn more about the big stuff before we go to the little stuff. So I wonder if it won't go the same way once we get into the biochemistry stuff. But I haven't read Behe's book, so I don't know the specific examples he's talking about either.
Right. If you should want to read books, don't read the first book, but rather Darwin's Black Box or his more recent books, because they have the newer stuff. So if you have the time and inclination to look into it.
So Creation Myths, he gave an example. Did you see that one about HIV, VPU, tetherin, antagonism requiring 4 to 7 specific mutations?
Possibly. I cannot say anything to it. Sorry.
Right. He had a
a
discussion with Michael Behe on his channel where he brought up this point, so people can go and watch that video. You can comment after the video and put the link there so people can go find it.
I'm simply totally out of my field of expertise. So
it was a really interesting conversation, and it wasn't too difficult for someone not of the background to kind of follow. Creationist is an evolutionary biologist. He does a lot with virology and stuff, and he and Michael had a very interesting, very entertaining and fun conversation about it that I certainly would recommend. So hopefully he puts it in the chat, because I think everyone here, if you enjoyed this kind of conversation, you would certainly.
Yeah, we'll get that link in the comments. CJ's asking, how are mutations that we discover are more likely than we thought incompatible with an omnipotent being? How is this entailed by omnipotence that something becomes unlikely?
Yeah, first, omnipotence or some kind of divine being plays no role in this argument. So the argument is simply we look at patterns and we first look, are the patterns unlikely, and what is the degree of unlikelihood compared to the probabilistic resources? And second, do these patterns either match some criterion, as this criterion of irreducible complexity, that it cannot be built up by a stepwise process, or does it match an independently giving pattern? So for nothing of this is any kind of necessity to invoke an omnipotent being. So even if you infer intelligent design on the level of biology, it could be aliens. And the interesting thing is Richard Dawkins has acknowledged that there could be a signature in the cell. He even used these words before the book by Stephen C. Meyer was written, that there could be some signature in the cell or in the genetic code that could suggest intelligent design. But then he would suppose that it was aliens, which of course just would shift the problem. Also, you could invoke this kind of matrix hypothesis. You could go even more crazy and invoke time-traveling genetics engineers from the future, or whatever you like. Or if you like supernatural explanation but don't like an omnipotent God, you could invoke angels and demons and whatever. So omnipotence doesn't play a role here. That is a theological issue, and that's interesting, but it has nothing to do with our discussion here. Of course, I suppose that the underlying thought is, why would an omnipotent God do it that way, or which is in a way also a theological question, or then invoking this problem of evil. Why is there so much suffering in the world if there is an omnipotent designer who could design diseases away or something? These are all interesting questions, but they have nothing to do with the scientific question: what is the inference to the best explanation to explain the data that we have? These are theological, philosophical musings that depend on your metaphysical background. So if you're a theist, then you will have to come up with some kind of theodicy and some kind of theological explanation. And if you're not, you would have to invoke some other explanations. But that's not my subject that I'm mainly interested in.
What I'd say on that is, finding, evidence for intelligent design by, having things unlikely to occur by natural processes in the cell would be evidence for God, but not finding that wouldn't be evidence against God, because God could just do it a different way. So if we don't find that, it's not evidence against God's existence. It's just we have one less reason to believe in God. That's all.
Yes, true. And I would qualify this a little bit, because there is something that I very much like that was said by an American philosopher, a Christian philosopher, addressing this question: could there be scientific evidence for the existence of God? And he said, well, science cannot prove God, because these are different fields. But what science can do is that science can provide evidence for the truth of premises in a philosophical argument that has theistic implications. So, for example, in this first cause argument, this Kalam argument for the existence of God based on the origin of the universe, there is the premise: everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, and then you can infer the cause must be outside of space and time, and blah, blah, blah. So science cannot prove God, but it can prove that the premise that the universe began to exist is true based on Big Bang cosmology. And similarly, if you have an intelligent design argument that some features in nature are better explained by the activity of an intelligent agent than by an unguided natural process, then of course this could be used to support a premise in a teleological argument for the existence of God. So that is what I think science can play a role in this discussion of theism versus atheism, but I don't think that science can directly prove God. So if you want to see some of the arguments that can support such premises and can infer this God hypothesis based on scientific evidence, there's a recent book called The Return of the God Hypothesis by Stephen Meyer, which just came out.
CJ clarified their question. I think you'd said something that if we do find that these things were more likely, we thought it would be incompatible with the God hypothesis. What I think you meant by that is the God hypothesis would be this particular argument for God's existence. And if we find that evidence, then we no longer have that argument. But it's not incompatible with God's existence.
Exactly.
And then they went on further. If it's not predicted on the hypothesis, then how is it evidence? Maybe I can explain that, because, like you might walk into someone's kitchen and find coffee grounds on the ground. There's a pretty good chance that somebody in the house drinks coffee if you find that. But if you walk into the kitchen and don't find that, it doesn't mean they don't drink coffee. They might just not have made a mess when they made their coffee or clean their house frequently. So not finding that could just be evidence that if God does exist, he's better at disguising his presence than we might otherwise think he would be.
And actually, it's not for nothing that you find in the realm of theists and of Christian theists different approaches to this question. And there are theistic evolutionists who totally accept, let's say, mainstream Darwinian biology and still believe in God for other reasons, for historical reasons of the Gospels or historical evidence for the resurrection or whatever, and don't care about the scientific stuff and think that this is well explained by Darwinian evolution. And others think that they have evidence in nature that points to intelligent design. So I would agree, if there is no evidence for intelligent design in nature, this just says, well, this is compatible with atheism, it's compatible with theism, it's not predicted, it is predicted by atheism, and therefore it's, let's say, in a Bayesian sense, it would rather favor the atheist hypothesis, but it is not excluded by the theistic hypothesis, and it's well compatible with versions of theism that would put the influence at the beginning outside of space and time, that in a way God instantiated this evolutionary process to bring his desired goal into being. So not finding evidence for design doesn't refute the God hypothesis, but it resonates better with the atheistic hypothesis. But finding evidence for design definitely is a problem for the atheistic hypothesis.
I think that is quite a good way of putting it. I mean, the whole point of science is not here to necessarily make any claims on anyone's theology. These two things can exist perfectly in tandem with one another, supposing that we're interpreting the data correctly. And there is no, as Gunter just said, there's a broad swath of, or broad group rather, of theistic evolutionists who do impeccable science, and they have absolutely no issue with Darwinian evolution. And then it's a gradient. There are some folks who maybe suppose that their theistic evolution, they think God sparked abiogenesis, or maybe the proto-eukaryotic transition, or maybe the Cambrian explosion, and it goes up through gradations. And myself, as someone who focuses more on macro level evolution of organisms and human evolution, as far as someone taking the position that this was spurred by someone or something, I'm totally fine with that. I don't have any particular issues with it. My hope is to just interpret the data and to know what happened, not who caused it to happen, or perhaps what caused it to happen, or even why it happened. It's just what occurred and what, well, I guess a bit of why, but what occurred and how indeed did that come to be and result in the biodiversity of life that we see today. So I think, I think that is perfectly reasonable. So I think what you said in the Bayesian sense is true. If we didn't find evidence for design, perhaps that would be in support of an atheist worldview in the sense of a predictive power. But that being said, I don't think in any sense that would preclude a theologic interpretation. It would simply complicate the issue, I guess. It would take you to the position where you would want to take a very basal theistic evolutionary stance. And Lord knows there's plenty of people who take that position and are perfectly fine with it. Those things marriage quite well to them. So,
There's an internet atheist argument that if it's unfalsifiable, then it's not a valid hypothesis. But the thing is, you can have an unfalsifiable hypothesis. The ontological thing which you're trying to establish the existence of might be unfalsifiable. But if your reasons for believing it are falsifiable, then you don't have a problem. Which, my coffee grounds analogy shows that, like if you go walk into the house and don't find coffee grounds, then it's like, well, it's unfalsifiable. Maybe somebody who lives there drinks coffee. But if you do find coffee grounds, then you have a falsifiable reason for believing somebody in that house drinks coffee.
Yeah, it tends to boil down to what kind of philosophy of science you take. And there are different perspectives on that, and there are merits to the different perspectives. And I myself, I do take the position that there are merits to how we look at it. I think that falsifiability is nice, but you can't always have it. For instance, phylogeny isn't necessarily in the sense that we're rooting it in something that is objectively falsifiable. It's more of those aspects of it are, and in the sense of the Bayesian analyses. But I would agree. Yeah, I would agree.
That's a good point, actually, with the phylogenetic tree, because if you find a bunch of disparate, organisms throughout the fossil record, and you say, oh, well, they're connected through all these branch lines. I mean, in some sense, that's unfalsifiable because you're just saying, well, there are intermediaries, but we haven't seen them. It's like, so the same objection could be leveled. No?
No, I have to pick the side of the Darwinist and explain a kind of prediction. So, based on the assumption of common ancestry and of this tree-like pattern, you can make certain predictions that cannot be made on the assumption of special creation. So, for example, about 10 years ago, specialists on arthropods made a prediction that spiders, even though there are no recent spiders and there were no fossil spiders then that have a tail like a scorpion or like a whip scorpion, they predicted, based on the reconstructed position of spiders in the tree of life, that there should have been spiders with a tail like a whip scorpion. But there were no remnants, no genetic precursors, nothing like that. And just a few years ago, in 100-million-year-old Burmese amber, they found these spiders which have precisely this predicted tail. So this is a fulfilled prediction, a very specific prediction that is based on this assumption of common ancestry. And that is a hallmark of a successful theory, that you can make a specific prediction and it turns out to be corroborated by new evidence. And that is one reason why I prefer the assumption of common ancestry, because it's not totally impossible, but it's difficult to find versions of a kind of progressive creationism where you have, let's say, independent special creation events over long Earth history that would predict these hierarchical pattern of character similarities. There have been approaches based on this so-called dependency graph suggestion by Winston Ewart, based on software design principles, where you have also this kind of inheritance-like processes without real inheritance. And I have suggested a possibility in this book chapter with Stephen Meyer, based on a fact that there was a branch of cladists, of phylogenetic school of doing phylogenetic research called the pattern cladist. And they said, hey, we can dispense with evolutionary theory. We can look for this hierarchical pattern for an independent reason, because this hierarchical pattern has is maximizing the way how you can store information in a system, because the information which group has which characters is inherited by this nested pattern of groups within groups. So you would have this kind of design principle of maximization of information content based on this hierarchical pattern. With something like this, you might make predictions similar to this prediction in the case of spiders or other cases. I had some cases in my own research where theoretical predictions turned out to be true with new fossils. But that is something where it's not just we are assuming common ancestry and making this stuff up. And you could explain, that is the common argument by Young Earth Creationists, that you could explain character similarity either by common ancestry or by common design, but you could not predict these unknown characters based on a common design assumption, because that is indeed compatible with all kinds of combination of characters, but you could predict it based on the common descent prediction. So I think there's a difference.
Yeah, and in the case of the common design from the perspective of the Young Earth Creationists, they're starting with these kind of progenitor times, right? These progenitors, these lines by which genetics cannot cross. And in that sense, common descent has the benefit of principles of heredity. So these concepts of traits are inherited, and you can't really draw a line by which inheritance begins and ends. And that really does go all the way back, as Gunter said, to common ancestry. I'm sorry if I misspoke earlier. When I was discussing the falsification of phylogeny, I didn't mean external to it, because Gunter is 100% correct in being a paleontologist. Of course he is. But the predictions based in phylogeny from the fossil record, and vice versa, relationships that are seen in the fossil record that are confirmed in phylogeny using genetics and molecular clocks and things of that nature, complement each other quite nicely. The classic, I didn't know about the whiptail scorpion example, or rather spider ancestor.
Nice example.
But
however, if I may just add one thing, of course, to be really fair, one, of course, may not cherry pick the data. So as Erika just said, there is a nice correspondence between phylogeny and the fossil record in terms, for example, if you have this branching pattern, you have a certain order of how these branchings appear, and then you have the fossil record, can look, is there an overall corresponding of the appearance in the stratigraphic sequence with the order of branchings of the tree. This is called stratigraphic fit. Now, what I have observed in many arguments in favor of common descent, where I agree with the ultimate conclusion, is that you cherry pick and just take the instances where you have good stratigraphic fit and say, well, that's supporting common ancestry, but try to forget about the many instances of poor stratigraphic fit or even totally off stratigraphic fit in terms of temporal paradoxa, where you should be fair and say, well, that could be in principle, conflicting evidence for common ancestry. If good stratigraphic fit supports common ancestry, bad stratigraphic fit contradicts common ancestry, and then we have to make an inference to the best explanation based on all the evidence. And look, what is the best explanation for all the evidence there? I think common ancestry is the best explanation. But it's not like there is no other information out there, so that it's totally unreasonable to be a progressive creationist like Vajrana. There are out-of-place fossils. There are temporal paradoxa. There is poor stratigraphic fit. There are biogeographical conundrums like the requirement to have neotropical monkeys traveling 1,500 kilometers across the Atlantic and survive to make it to South America. These are problems that also have to be accounted for in your overall framework.
I must push back a bit on that. I think specifically in the case of the Platyrrhine arrival in the New World, this modeling ancient currents is quite easy from a meteorological perspective. And with that in mind, taking those ancient currents from, say, it would have been like the Eocene, Oligocene, it would take about 11 days on some kind of map.
No, I have looked into this case, actually. It would have been 60 days based on the actual currents at this time, and 60 days for a mammal that requires not only drinking, there is a more severe empirical problem with the whole thing. That is, a single monkey doesn't do. You have to get even two monkeys don't do. A pregnant female might do, but it is, you would see a bottleneck probably if it would have been a single animal. So you would need a kind of population.
A single animal would not work. Fortunately, to our knowledge, especially in the Fayum, which is where these organisms would come from, these proteopithecids, you're dealing with organisms that are inherently social. These guys aren't solitary. If one is swept on a vegetative mat, you're going to get movement.
Yes.
And the key thing about that, I want to know where you're getting this 60 number from, because everything I've seen is it seems to hold that this conventional acceptance is about 11 days.
You can find the paper. You can Google Bechly and rafting. I've written an article on these rafting hypotheses where you find the evidence, also including all the empirical evidence that we have that vertebrate animals did raft. There are only two examples. One is iguanas in the Caribbean, which were drifted during a hurricane about 200 kilometers from one island to the other. And then the other only example we have is an Aldabra turtle that was found in the ocean off the East African coast, also just some few hundred kilometers away from the coast. There is not a single instance in the whole history of human seafaring where we have found, with this thousands and thousands of ships crossing the ocean, where anybody ever reported finding a float of vegetation drifting on the ocean with some mice or monkeys or whatever on it. And
I think that's true, but I want to push back on that as well, because the climate is not nearly as conducive to such travel today as it used to be. The continents of North and South America versus these areas where, for instance, primates would have this incentive to raft and to be exposed to tropical conditions that would actually create these vegetative mats that they could then occupy. It doesn't exist today. So of course we would have.
Yeah.
There's
still have thousands. don't you find it? I agree that it somehow probably happened because I believe in common ancestry, but don't you find it strange to have a group of monkeys, let's say 40, 50 in a floating tree? In one of the papers, they even, because they realized that 60 days are too long, and that is probably where your time would be. What did you say, 8 days? I think that's correct. I read this as well. What they had to propose is a sailing hypothesis. And the sailing, to speed this up, the sailing hypothesis is that in this floating mat of vegetation, you had upright trees, which had still foliage, and then the wind, which was pushing in the right direction, would, in a kind sail, push this whole float towards South America. I don't know if you have ever went with a boat on the Atlantic Ocean, wherever, and imagine that you have this upright standing tree on the waves on the Atlantic Ocean, rafting for over a week. That's ridiculous.
Of course. I mean, I agree with that. I don't think that it's going to be sailing, but if memory serves, the paper actually outlines multiple different scenarios, and that was kind of the more out there version, that maybe that's where the 8 is coming from, but 11 is what I've typically heard. And you have to keep in mind too, these proteopithecids, the ones that we're talking about that would raft, they're not monkeys in the sense that we think of today.
Yeah, and yes, still strange. We have weirder cases in this, and I just mentioned this to show it's not like biogeography is all supporting common ancestry. There are strange cases. So other strange cases are with Caecilians, these blind earth-living amphibians which look like snakes. There you have to invoke 5 or 6 different instances where these not only terrestrial but digging blind animals were transported from Africa to North America, back to Europe, with different floating events. It's strange. You have one tarantula case in Australia, which would have crossed the Indian Ocean for 10,000 kilometers. Maybe the bowies on the Fiji Islands, the iguanas on the Samoa Islands. Yeah, sure, maybe it happened some way, but it's still something where I would say these are biogeographical conundrums that at least pose some difficulty. You have to come up with strange things where there's not a single example that we have observed something like this happening. You have to come up with, well, it was very different in the past. We had different climate, different currents. Maybe it could happen that 50 monkeys crossed 1,500 kilometers across the Atlantic Ocean, but it's still strange. It's still something that should bother.
Yes, I agree. I think it is strange, but strange characterizes massive portions of extant biology as well. And I would propose that it's very interesting that the modern versions of rafting tend to be in these shallow sea areas like the Caribbean, which are experiencing these massive hurricane-style seasons. Interestingly enough, other not contemporary, historic cases of rafting that have been proposed have also been in areas with severe cyclones, monsoons, hurricane-style seasons, which is very convenient, is it not? It seems like all of our rafting events do seem to occur in these localities that, like biogeographically speaking, that are exposed to these vegetation, ripping, tossing, all of these different horrific weather conditions that end up landing animals where they shouldn't be, colonizing new islands and the like.
That bothers me as an entomologist is then it would be much easier for insects to do the whole thing. And then we should observe this phenomenon that you have these kind of strange relationships between African and South American forms, where you would have to invoke this kind of rafting hypothesis in other groups like insects even more frequently. But the instances I know for South America and Africa are basically the hysteriomorph rodents and the platyrrhine, no, it's not platyrrhine, strepsirrhine, platyrrhine monkeys.
You're right, platyrrhine. Yeah, you're totally right. I think the difference plays.
So the tropical monkeys and some group of rodents.
Yeah.
And then you, Hannah?
I was just going to say, I agree. I think the difference is huge.
Yeah.
If you're talking about a transatlantic journey, you have to have organisms that are to some degree cognitively inclined, I would imagine. That's my personal perspective. You're dealing with several dozen or so. I wouldn't go with 50. You don't need that many. Platyrrhines, monkeys in general, are notoriously robust and they tend to thrive in places that they can get to. They're wily little critters. Getting them to South America, and I'm gonna look up that number. I'm gonna track down that 60 days number because I've not heard that before. 11 is typically what I've seen. And these vegetative mats, they're common in these, like they're supposed to be quite common in areas that are prone to hurricanes and things of that nature. I was very recently in the Exumas about a month ago.
Why don't happen it all the time in the Caribbean? You have hurricanes, several hurricanes every year. Why don't you find these iguanas transposed from one island to the other constantly? There's just one case.
They do, because I was just in the Exumas in the Bohemian Islands about a month ago, maybe less than a month ago, and these rock iguanas are colonizing actively new keys down there, from Leaf Key to Allen's Key, and they're distantly apart. These marine iguanas couldn't possibly make that swim on their own, or if they do, then they're very lucky iguanas. But the hurricane seasons, as they ramp up, at least according to the locals, they have critters showing up where they shouldn't. So precisely what you're saying, at least according to my anecdotal experience and what the folks who are living there are saying, it is happening.
That's interesting. I grant you this point. If you have seen this, that's interesting. But actually, from the published evidence, I haven't found any other instance than this case of one transposal of iguanas to an island where they didn't exist before. And certainly, of course, if you have short distances, then let's say islands that are just inside of a bigger island, there you have exchange, of course, more frequently, because that is in the distance. These animals can swim, and they do swim.
Yeah.
So
right.
I still find it strange. I agree that strange things happen, and given long periods of time, strange things might happen a little bit more. My point is simply, if we look at all these different phenomena, that there is still some stuff where I say, well, those people who doubt universal common ancestry and say, well, it's not all rosy and clearly pointing into one direction, they have a point. There is some stuff. Also, the fact that convergence, these really bothering amount of conflicting evidence, which when I studied, which was probably a little bit earlier than you did, we were still thinking, and I was studying in Tübingen where Willy Hennig had his first followers, and we had the let's say direct training in phylogenetic systematics from the first follower of Willy Hennig, and I had my position in Stuttgart in the position that Willy Hennig formerly held. And when we started, we still thought, well, convergence, that's a marginal phenomenon that's producing a little bit of noise, but overall we have a strong phylogenetic signal. But it turned out over the year that this convergence is much more an ubiquitous phenomenon than we expected, and is posing much bigger problems. And we have to invoke all these mechanisms of incomplete lineage sorting and horizontal gene transfer to account for the amounts of convergence. And we agree, I also agree that still common ancestry is the best explanation. But if homology is supporting common ancestry, then we have to agree that homoplasy is at least potentially conflicting evidence, which is also shown by the fact that if you, let's say, have now 80 characters that point to a sister group relationship and 20 conflicting characters, you explain them away as homoplasies. But if new data come in and suddenly you have 80 characters for this relationship and 100 characters for the other, it switches, and the characters that you before treated as synapomorphies become homoplasies. So it can be conflicting evidence for the hypothesis of common ancestry. It's a valid argument, and then you have to use all the evidence to decide.
So I think I might push back just a slight bit, and I know we've been going for a long time, but I want to add something to that because I think there's a huge difference between posing a problem and posing a question. I think that there being an open-ended, we don't have this figured out yet, doesn't serve as a conclusion to something or as evidence against it.
Yeah, but that's conflicting evidence. So don't you agree? If you have have two alternative phylogenetic hypotheses, and you have one hypothesis of common ancestry for A and B, and one hypothesis for B and C. And you have a different set of characters supporting both hypotheses. You have to use parsimony to decide which characters to treat as synapomorphies, as homologies, as evidence for common ancestry, and explain away the other characters as homoplasies. If new data come in and the case turns, then suddenly you treat the other characters as homoplasies, and the previously homoplasies become suddenly interpreted as homologies, as synapomorphies, and this shows it is conflicting evidence.
But I don't think so. So let me put it another way, and I think you put it quite elegantly earlier. The situation with common ancestry results in the reason why this is the most well accepted idea as far as origins of biodiversity of life on Earth comes from this preponderance of data from numerous different independent fields.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah.
Yes, that points into the direction of, hey, it's probably common ancestry, right? And given that this idea of common ancestry, this natural selection and mutation resulting in evolution, does lie at the foundation of much of biology, it seems to me that if you're going to take an independent line of evidence and say this in isolation may be more troublesome for common ancestry and intelligent, or than it is for intelligent design. That being said, I would propose that it would be almost irresponsible to then say, okay, well, that puts separate creation back on the table, because the far more parsimonious answer, at least as has been in the history of science as we know it, is that there is something that we are as yet not accounting. And that has been persistently the case from medicine to things like geology and indeed for biology. So I don't think that bringing it up and saying, look, this is evidence against common descent. I think it's much more accurate to say that this presents a question for common descent that at present does not pose a problem for the particular, in isolation, for the particular notion of separate creation or intelligent design. However, as scientists, we have to take the entirety into consideration when looking at what's going to be our best bet with regard to making predictions and using it in application and explaining things.
Right. Yeah, I can totally, let's say, agree that we can make this semantic distinction between problem and conflicting evidence, but still, you must be open to the possibility that if the amount of questioning evidence would accumulate, which is what is happening when you have, let's say, a scientific theory that is slowly showing problems, and the problems accumulate, and in the beginning, of course, you're not throwing away your hypothesis only because you have one or two conflicting evidences. You rather accommodate these evidences in your theory. No physicist would throw away the standard model of particle physics only because some strange data from CERN come in. But if these accumulate and you see that you reach this tipping point which requires a paradigm shift, then you should at least be open to have these different items on your radar, that if they become bigger and bigger, that you're still open to reconsider your general conclusions. So as I said, we agree currently with the current state of knowledge, the best explanation is common ancestry, and the rest may be strange, but if common ancestry is true, it has to have some kind of explanation. But it's still a lot of weird stuff out there that if it should accumulate, and if more stuff should come, so that would bring this to a tipping point, then this would be valid evidence for something else. So or let's put it another way. You cannot have your cake and eat it. You cannot say, well, homology is supporting common ancestry and evolution, and homoplasy, because it's predicted by the process of evolution, is also supporting evolution. You have to at least acknowledge that if homoplasy would be the rule and homology would be the exception, then there would be a problem for the theory.
I think it's more the way that I would put it is like the difference between Newtonian physics and relativity. It's like we've got this very robust set of principles in Newtonian physics that can explain much of the motion of things in action around us today. But once you get to a different scale, once you move up to planetary bodies, relativity must be invoked in order to make sense of the data. I think that probably what's going to be quite similar is with this kind of battle between homoplasy and homology. I think we're probably going to see something similar in concept, where, like you've said, you've got sets of criteria where one apply, and we tend to find these sets of criteria in relation to, for instance, homology, and something similar with homoplasy. It's just I don't think that has been put together in an elegant way yet. But I think it's jumping the gun to almost point to it and say this is going to remain.
I wouldn't. Well, you have a minority of conflicting evidence, and therefore throw your theory out of the window. That would be idiotic. So, but you at least have to be open that maybe your case is not like Newtonian physics. Maybe it's like Ptolemaic astronomy, and your epicycles at one point break down, and you have to reconsider the model. So that is my point. But currently, it looks like we have the case where we are rather like Newtonian physics, and we have some anomalies that require explanation.
Sure. So I would agree, and I think the real strength of it comes down to as we were talking about earlier, specifically in relation to paleontology, but this applies in spades when it comes to medicine, virology, and things of that nature. But it's the ability to predict. It's the ability to take this set of observations and make accurate predictions about the world around us. Because in the end, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to learn. So. Well,
it becomes much more fun when we have stuff that is more controversial. So we shouldn't agree on so much. So it's boring.
Man, yeah, this was a blast. This was very fun. Yeah. You're gonna have Jackson knocking at your Jackson Wheat's gonna be knocking at your door.
Yeah, sure.
Cambrian, and that's not really my area, but he loves.
Well, we will stay in touch, and maybe we can set something up here or at another place. But let's say later this year, because currently I'm work till here.
I know how that is.
We'll see. Yeah, I'd love to host more of these. This was lots of fun. I don't know how you guys are doing for time. Maybe we should just wrap it up.
We can wrap it up. I don't really have anything to do, but yeah, I don't want to. We've been here for quite some time. I'm sure everybody is fatigued.
This is my longest stream yet. There was one question, which was you gave the example of the spider and the phylogenetic tree as a prediction made by evolution. Do we have any similar quality of prediction on the hypothesis of intelligent design?
Yeah, for example, I would bring the case of junk DNA, the example with the irreducible complexity, that it will not be possible to explain structures like the bacterial flagellum by a stepwise process, and you just have to find some. And as Erika said, it doesn't have to be the true scenario how it happened, because we have no time machine. We will never know. But as soon as you have one plausible scenario that explains all the evidence elegantly with some kind of mechanistic process, stepwise, how the bacterial flagellum could arise, then you have refuted this thing, this prediction. And other prediction, this universal probability bound. And so their prediction in the fossil record would be that even if we find more and more fossils, as it happened in this case of appearance of the flowering plants, these problems of the Cambrian explosion and the sudden appearances will become bigger and not smaller. And so there are various predictions that can be made from the theory. And even in practical cases, so of course, if you look at certain issues in, let's say, molecular biology, it's not like a scientist goes to the lab and you tell him observe, and then he does his job. It's the first question will be observe what. So you have certain questions that you ask nature, and then you do your experiments to explore nature in the framework of these questions. And if you have this design approach, then you may ask different questions in terms of design principles at work on the molecular level than you do when you have an approach from an unguided process. So there could be different predictions on let's say the question of how is the genetic code structures, what kind of design principle do we find there that we would predict from, let's say, software design, like redundant information storage or overlapping information storage. So there's a lot of possible predictions.
Cool. I've got a link in the description to a talk from Günter Bechly where he gives his case about the fossil record not supporting intelligent design, not supporting evolution in more detail. I've got a link to Erika's channel. Any final points?
This is really fun.
Fun talk.
This is very enjoyable. I look forward to I hope to see just from my curiosity side, intelligent design take on more of these predictive challenges and formulate this robust set of criteria and a testable model. I look forward to that. If what Gunter says is indeed the case and that's what they're working on, then I'm excited to see what they have.
That's what we hope to do. So we will see, and I will send you the manuscript as soon as it is ready for submission, prior to submission, so we can use your input to prove it.
I'll do my best. I'll do my best.
So this is
cool. So that's very nice. It was really fun to talk to you.
Yeah.
Hope we can repeat it someday.
I had a lot of fun
Absolutely.
too. Maybe we can do. I'll see if we can do the Jackson wheat one on this channel too. We'll see, but I'd love to host that as well. This is the first evolution one I've hosted. I've been wanting to do evolution, but I'm not so expert at it myself, and I was wanted to do a good job of it. So I'm very glad I got to organize this and have two people who actually know what they're talking about and who actually discuss the arguments. Don't just like that whole thing. Anyone who doesn't accept if it were true, it would be widely accepted, or all that sort of genetic fallacies and begging the questions and appeals to authority. So this has been a great discussion. Be sure to subscribe and like and comment, and we'll leave it there. Thanks for coming on, guys. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Get my outro.
So, everybody, stay away from the virus.
Hare Krishna.
Keeps